In the great hall of Winterfell, a king sits beside the man who was once his brother in all but blood, and between them sits a lie that has lasted 14 years. Robert Baratheon has come north to name Ned Stark his hand, to bind the man he trusts most to the throne he governs least. But in the yard beyond the hall, a dark-haired boy practices swordsmanship with a grace that does not belong to any bastard of the north. The boy's name is Jon Snow, and the truth of his blood is about to destroy the most powerful friendship in the Seven Kingdoms. What if Robert Baratheon found out about Jon Snow? A Tales of Westeros script, the first full story in the great hall of Winterfell. A king sits beside the man who was once his brother in all but blood, and between them sits a lie that has lasted 14 years. Robert Baratheon has come north to name Ned Stark his hand, to bind the man he trusts most to the throne he governs least. But in the yard beyond the hall, a dark-haired boy practices swordsmanship with a grace that does not belong to any bastard of the north. The boy's name is Jon Snow, and the truth of his blood is about to destroy the most powerful friendship in the Seven Kingdoms. The king's arrival, the royal procession, entered Winterfell through the Hunter's Gate on a morning cold enough to turn breath visible. 300 riders, a wheelhouse the size of a small house, the Kingsguard in white cloaks, and the Baratheon stag flying above a king who had outgrown his armor and his enthusiasm for governance in roughly equal measure. Robert Baratheon dismounted with the grunt of a large man whose body remembered agility and whose joints had overruled the memory. He was broader than Ned remembered, heavier in the face and the belly, the warrior's frame carrying the accumulated weight of 14 years of feasts and hunting and the steady erosion that comes from ruling a kingdom through delegation rather than effort. He crossed the courtyard and embraced Ned with the full body force of a man who expressed affection through impact. The embrace lasted several seconds, long enough to be genuine, long enough for Ned to feel the sheer mass of the man who had once swung a warhammer with enough force to cave in Rhaegar Targaryen's breastplate. "You've gotten old," Robert said. "You've gotten fat," Ned replied. Robert laughed, the laugh enormous, authentic, the sound of a man who was happy for the first time in months and did not care who heard it. He slapped Ned's shoulder and surveyed Winterfell with the possessive admiration of a man returning to a place that reminded him of the version of himself he preferred. "Take me to your crypt," Robert said. "I want to pay my respects." The feast that evening filled the great hall with noise, fire, and more food than the castle's kitchens had produced in a single evening since Ned's own wedding. Robert sat at the high table between Ned and Cersei, drinking Arbor Gold with the concentration of a man performing his primary skill. He told stories about the war, the same stories, each growing in the retelling, and laughed at his own humor, and demonstrated, with every gesture and every word, that the king was a man who had peaked at 19 and spent the subsequent years trying to return to that altitude through repetition. Cersei sat beside him in green silk, her golden hair in elaborate Lannister coils, her expression arranged in the precise tolerance of a woman who had spent 14 years studying the distance between her husband's self-image and his reality, and had found the distance contemptible. Ned noticed Jon at the back of the hall, seated with the bastards, as Catelyn's protocol demanded. The boy was 14, lean and dark-haired, with the long, stark face and grey eyes that marked him as Ned's blood. Jon sat with Ghost at his feet, watching the high table with the quiet attention of someone accustomed to observing from distances he had not chosen. Robert noticed him too. "That your bastard?" Robert gestured with his cup, wine sloshing over the rim. "Jon, yes, he looks like you. More than any of your true-born sons." Robert squinted across the hall. Strong-looking boy. "What is he, 14? 15? 14. Same age we were when Aaron took us. Remember? 2 boys in the eyrie, training with swords too heavy for us." Robert drank deeply. "Your bastard fights? He trains with Rob. He's capable." "Capable?" Robert dismissed the word. "I'll watch him spar tomorrow. I want to see if the Stark blood breeds true in the natural sons too." The comment landed without weight, a king's idle curiosity at a feast, nothing more. But something in Robert's attention lingered on the boy longer than the moment required. not suspicion, not recognition. Something closer to the edge of a thought that had not yet formed, a connection the mind was reaching for without the conscious permission of the man who owned it. Ned changed the subject. He had been changing this subject for 14 years. Oh, the crypts beneath Winterfell ran deeper than the castle above. Generations of Stark dead seated in granite, their stone direwolves at their feet. The darkness broken by torchlight that made the carved faces flicker as if the dead were breathing. Robert walked ahead. He had insisted on coming here immediately after arriving, before the feast, before the council, before the business that had brought him north. The visit was ritual. Every time Robert came to Winterfell, and he had come only once before, for the wedding, he made the same pilgrimage, as if the crypt were a temple and the woman interred in it were his deity. Lyanna's statue stood in the alcove Ned's father had commissioned. The stone face was a sculptor's approximation, close enough to trigger memory, distant enough to remind the viewer that stone was not flesh, and never would be. Robert had placed a feather in her carved hand during his last visit. The feather was still there, brittle and grey with age. He replaced it with a fresh one. The gesture was tender, enormous hands performing a delicacy that the rest of Robert's life did not contain. She deserved better than a statue. She did. I would have given her everything, Ned. I would have been a different king, a different man. Everything I've failed at, the drinking, the whoring, the letting the realm go to rot, that's because she wasn't there. She was supposed to be there. He took her. Ned said nothing. He had heard variations of this speech a dozen times, and each time the speech revealed less about Lyanna and more about the architecture of Robert's grief, a structure so elaborate that challenging any single element would collapse the whole. "Tell me again," Robert said, "how you found her. You've heard it. Tell me again." Ned drew a breath, the practiced version, honed by 14 years of repetition, smoothed by the constant pressure of needing every word to be technically true, while carrying a weight of omission that would have crushed a less disciplined man. "After the Trident, I rode south. I found her in Dawn. In a tower. She was ill. Fever. She died in my arms." The tower. Robert turned from Lyanna's statue. Torchlight caught his face. The eyes smaller in their fleshy setting, but sharp, sharper than people credited. "I asked you about the tower, years ago. 3 Kingsguard. Arthur Dane, Oswell Went, Gerald Hightower, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard and 2 of his best, sitting in a tower in the mountains of Dawn while the dynasty they served collapsed. They were following Rhaegar's last orders." Rhaegar's last orders. Robert's mouth twisted around the name the way it always did, the syllables producing a physical revulsion that 14 years had not diminished. "What orders? Guard the hostage? You don't assign Arthur Dane to guard a hostage, Ned. Arthur Dane was the finest sword in the 7 Kingdoms. You assign him to protect something irreplaceable. Robert, what were they protecting? My sister. As best I can understand it." Robert turned back to the statue. His hand rested on the stone, fingers spread across the carved shoulder, and the touch carried the intimacy of a man who had never stopped reaching for a woman who had been dead for 14 years. "I killed him," Robert said. "At the Trident. My hammer went through his chest. The rubies scattered across the ford. They still find them in the riverbed. Did you know that? Fishermen pull up rubies from Rhaegar's breastplate. I killed him, and I would kill him again, every day, for what he did to her." Ned stood in the crypt beside his oldest friend and listened to the grief and the rage and the absolute certainty that Robert had built his life upon. And he said nothing, because what he carried, the truth that would demolish every word Robert had just spoken, was a weight that could not be set down in this place, before these dead. In the presence of a man whose identity was constructed from the lie. They left the crypts in silence. The dead watched them go. The yard the morning was bright and bitter, northern sunlight that illuminated without warming, turning the practice yard into a stage of packed earth and breath fog. Rob and Jon sparred with wooden swords under Sir Roderick Castle's instruction. They had been training since dawn, a routine that neither the king's arrival nor the previous night's feast had interrupted. Robb fought like a tullybred to Stark, powerful, direct, with the organized aggression of a boy trained to lead. Jon fought differently. His movements were economical, fluid, his footwork placing him where the opponent's blade was not rather than where he could generate the most force. Robert watched from the gallery above, a cup of wine in his hand, despite the hour. The hangover sat behind his eyes, but the eyes were working. The combat instinct that no amount of wine could fully erode was reading the spar with the attention of a man who had fought in a war and survived through skill rather than caution. "The bastard," Robert said. Ned stood beside him, wrapped in furs. "He's good. He is. He doesn't fight like a northerner. Robb does. See, there, the power through the shoulder, the forward pressure. That's northern sword work. Direct, your bastard, he's sliding. Redirecting, that's a different school. Sir Roderick teaches them both. Sir Roderick teaches northern style. The boy learned something else somewhere, or he's inventing it on his own." Robert drank. His eyes remained on Jon. "Who does he remind you of?" The question arrived casually, the conversational afterthought of a man watching young men fight and thinking about the fighters he had known. But the question contained a charge that Ned felt in his chest. "He's my blood. I can see that. The face is yours. The build, lean, fast, not the broad shoulders. More like..." Robert trailed off. The thought was there, at the edge of articulation, reaching for a comparison that his conscious mind had not yet permitted. He shook his head. Who was his mother, Ned? "Robert, 14 years. You've never told me. The most honorable man in the Seven Kingdoms fathers a bastard during a war and won't name the woman. I've asked. You've deflected. Every time. It's not important. It was important enough for you to lie to your wife about it." Robert's gaze shifted from the yard to Ned's face. "Lady Catelyn doesn't know, does she? There's nothing to know. There's always something to know. I've been a king for 14 years. The one thing I've learnt about secrets is that the men who say they don't have any are carrying the heaviest ones." Below them, Jon disarmed Robb with a turning motion that sent Robb's wooden sword spinning across the hard-packed earth. Robb laughed and retrieved it. Jon did not laugh. He reset his stance with the composed discipline of a fighter who took no pleasure in winning and considerable interest in improving. Robert watched. He said nothing more about the boy's mother. He did not need to. The question had been planted, and questions planted in Robert Baratheon's mind did not grow toward subtlety, they grew toward confrontation. The hunt they rode out the following day with a small party: Robert, Ned, Jory Castle, 2 Baratheon men-at-arms, and enough dogs to track a boar that Robert had no serious intention of finding. The hunt was a pretext. The ride was the purpose. 2 men on horseback, separated from court and council and the obligations of their respective titles, returning to the dynamic that had defined their youth. Robert talking, Ned listening. The conversation wandering until it arrived at whatever Robert had actually wanted to discuss. They watered the horses at a stream 2 hours north of Winterfell. The dogs ranged ahead. The Baratheon men stayed back at a gesture from their king. Jory moved to follow, but Ned shook his head. Robert dismounted with a grunt and sat on a fallen log, his weight settling into it with the authority of a man who made every surface look like a throne. "The Tower of Joy," Robert said. Ned's hand stilled on his horse's bridle. "I've been thinking about it. Since the crypt." Robert pulled a wineskin from his saddle and drank. 3 Kingsguard. Not any 3, the Lord Commander, the Sword of the Morning, and Oswell Went. The 3 best swords Aerys possessed. And they weren't at the Trident, where their prince died. They weren't at King's Landing, where their king died. They were at a tower in the Red Mountains of Dawn, guarding your sister. Robert, this was 14 years ago. 14 years ago, a man stole the woman I loved, and 3 of the finest knights in the world sat in a tower watching over her while the realm burned. I've accepted that story for 14 years, because you told it to me, and I trust you more than any man alive. But I'm not stupid, Ned. I'm fat, and I drink too much, and I let the Lannisters run my kingdom, but I am not stupid. Robert set down the wineskin. His face had changed, the jovial mask stripped away, replaced by something harder. The man beneath the king. The soldier beneath the celebrant. The Kingsguard swore an oath to protect the royal family. Not hostages. Not prisoners. The royal family. Arthur Dayne did not sit in a tower for a year guarding a kidnapped girl. He sat in that tower because he was protecting someone who was, by his oath, part of the Targaryen bloodline. You're reaching, am I? Robert leaned forward. Lyanna was in that tower for close to a year. You found her dying. You came back from Dawn with a baby and a dead sister, and a story about a tavern girl whose name you've never spoken. The baby was the right age. The tower was in the right place. And you have never, not once in 14 years, been able to look me in the eye when I ask about the boy's mother. The stream ran between them, clear water over grey stone. The dogs barked somewhere in the distance. The morning was silent except for water and the sound of Robert Baratheon arriving at a conclusion he had been out running for 14 years. How old is the boy? Robert. How old? 14. Born during the war. Many children were born during the war. Born during the war. In the south. While you were campaigning in Dawn, while your sister was dying in a tower guarded by 3 members of the Kingsguard. Robert stood. The motion was sudden, the explosiveness of a man whose body remembered violence even when his mind pursued conversation. You told me you fathered a bastard on some woman during the campaign. You, Eddard Stark, the most honorable man in the 7 kingdoms, the man who would sooner cut off his own hand than break a vow. You want me to believe that you broke your marriage oath to Catelyn Tully within months of swearing it. Men do things during war, other men, not you. I have known you since we were boys. I watched you refuse a serving girl at the Eyrie because you said a man's word should mean something. You married Catelyn, and you have been faithful to her for 14 years. And you were faithful to her during the war, and the boy is not yours. The last sentence landed flat. Not a question, not an accusation. A conclusion. Reached through the emotional logic of a man who did not think in abstractions, but who loved with an intensity that gave him access to truths more cerebral minds might have missed. Robert Baratheon was not clever, but he had loved Ned Stark for 30 years, and he had loved Lyanna Stark for longer than that, and the love gave him a clarity about both that no spymaster's intelligence could replicate. Ned said nothing. Robert stared at him. The stare was the weight of a kingdom pressing on a single question. Not yours, Robert repeated. Hers. Nu. 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 The question. The Godswood was the oldest part of Winterfell. Older than the walls, older than the towers, older than every stone that human hands had placed. The heart tree's carved face wept red sap in the last light, and beneath it, 2 men who had been brothers stood on opposite sides of a truth that had waited 14 years to emerge. Robert had insisted on this place. Not the hall, not the Lord's chamber, not any room where servants might hear or Cersei might listen from behind a door. The Godswood, Ned's temple, the place where Starks swore their oaths. Robert wanted the truth extracted in the only court Ned Stark could not dissemble in. Tell me I'm wrong. Robert's voice was stripped of the bluster that usually armored it. No joviality. No volume. The voice of a man asking a question whose answer he already suspected and desperately hoped to be contradicted. Tell me the boy is yours. Tell me you fathered him on some girl whose name you're too ashamed to speak. Tell me that, Ned. I am asking you. As your friend, as your king, as the man who loved your sister. Tell me I am wrong. Ned stood before the heart tree. The weirwood's eyes watched, red, ancient, carved by hands dead for millennia. The old gods witnessed everything. They forgave nothing. And they did not permit the kind of lie that Ned had been living for 14 years to survive in their presence when the question was finally asked without disguise. 14 years. He had carried this weight for 14 years, through his marriage, through the raising of his children, through the governance of the North. He had let Catelyn believe he was unfaithful. He had let the realm believe he was dishonorable. He had taken the stain on his own name to protect a promise made to a dying woman in a blood-soaked tower, and the promise had cost him every day since. And now the man he had built the lie to protect the boy from was standing before him in the godswood, asking, "Robert, say it. Say the words. The boy is mine. 4 words. Say them, and I will believe you, and we will never discuss it again." Ned looked at his friend. His king. The man who had smashed Rhaegar Targaryen's chest at the Trident and called it justice. The man who had ordered the deaths of Targaryen children and called it necessity. The man who would, if he learnt the truth, have every reason and every authority to demand the death of a 14-year-old boy whose only crime was the blood running through his veins. He tried. He opened his mouth to speak the lie one final time. To add one more repetition to the 14 years of repetitions that had kept Jon alive. To look Robert in the eye and say what needed to be said. He could not. The silence lasted 5 heartbeats. In the godswood, under the eyes of gods older than the kingdoms of men, Eddard Stark's silence spoke what his voice would not. Robert's face changed, not all at once. The change moved through him in stages, visible as weather crossing a landscape. Confusion first. Then, recognition. Then, the beginning of something vast and terrible that started in his eyes and spread outward until his entire body carried it. "No," Robert said. Ned did not speak. "Ned, no." "She was dying," Ned said. The words came now, not the practiced version, not the polished deflection, but the raw truth that had been compressed inside him for 14 years, emerging under pressure the way water emerges from fractured stone. She was in the tower. There was blood. So much blood. She was dying, and she put him in my arms, and she said, she made me promise. "Promise me, Ned." Those were her words. The last words she ever spoke. Robert's face was the face of a man watching his own house burn. His name. What is his name? She named him. A Targaryen name. I called him Jon. After Jon Arryn. Yes, you named Rhaegar Targaryen's son after the man who raised us. The sentence hung in the godswood. Above them, the heart tree wept its red tears. Around them, the ancient wood stood witness to the destruction of something that had survived a war and a rebellion and 14 years of governance, and was now breaking apart in a place where breaking things was not supposed to be possible. Robert turned away. He walked 3 steps toward the pool beneath the weirwood and stopped. His back was to Ned. His shoulders, massive, carrying the physical memory of a man who had once been the most dangerous fighter in the 7 kingdoms, rose and fell with breathing that had become labored. "You lied to me." "Yes, for 14 years. Yes, you brought that. You brought his son into your home. You raised him beside your children. You fed him at your table. You trained him with your sons. Rhaegar's blood, in your house, under your protection, and you never told me. If I had told you, you would have killed him." Robert spun. The motion was pure violence, the body's translation of a rage that language could not contain. His fist struck the weirwood's trunk. The impact split his knuckles open. Blood ran down the white bark, mixing with the red sap, and Robert did not appear to notice. He stole her from me. Robert. He stole her from M.E. The roar filled the godswood, scattering ravens from the branches overhead, echoing off the ancient walls. And she went with him. She chose him. She chose that silver-haired bastard over me. And she had his child, and she died giving birth to his child. And you, my brother, my friend, the one man in the 7 kingdoms I would have trusted with my life, you took that child, and you hid him from me, and you let me believe for 14 years that the woman I loved was stolen, was taken against her will, was a victim, when he could not finish. The sentence contained a truth that Robert Baratheon had spent his entire adult life refusing to construct. And constructing it now, in this place, under these trees, was an act of demolition so complete that the builder could not survive the building. Robert sank onto the root of the heart tree. He sat with his bleeding hand cradled against his chest and his face carrying an expression Ned had never seen on him. Not rage, not grief, but the vacancy of a man whose foundation had been removed and who was discovering, in real time, what remained when the foundation was gone. Nothing remained. That was what his face said. Nothing. She loved him, Robert said. The words were quiet. Quieter than any words Ned had ever heard Robert speak. She loved him, and not me. Ned stood before the heart tree and watched his oldest friend arrive at a truth that 14 years of lies had been designed to prevent, and the prevention had failed, and the truth was doing exactly what Ned had always feared it would do. It was destroying him. The king's command Robert did not emerge from the godswood for 2 hours. Ned waited at the edge of the tree line, not following, not intruding, giving the man the space that grief required and that rage demanded. When Robert finally appeared, the blood on his hand had dried to dark crusts across his knuckles, and his face had settled into something Ned recognized from the war, the battle mask. The expression Robert wore when he intended violence and considered the intention righteous. "The boy," Robert said. "Bring him to me." No, the refusal stopped Robert mid-stride. He turned to face Ned with the full weight of the crown behind his eyes. Not the ceremonial crown, not the political authority, but the raw power of a man who commanded the largest army in the 7 kingdoms and who had spent his adult life believing that his will and the law were the same thing. That was not a request. That was a command from your king. And I am refusing it. You cannot refuse a royal command. I am refusing this one. Robert took a step forward. The step was the physical prelude to violence, the body's announcement that the mind had exhausted its alternatives. 20 years ago, the step would have preceded a blow from the warhammer that had killed Rhaegar Targaryen. Now it preceded a confrontation between 2 men who had fought side by side and who were discovering, in the cold air of a northern morning, that the bond between them had limits neither had ever tested. He is Rhaegar's son. He is a Targaryen. The Targaryens are the enemies of this realm, and every Targaryen who draws breath is a threat to the throne I sit. He is a 14-year-old boy who has never left the north. He doesn't know who his father was. He trains with wooden swords and dreams of taking the black. He is not a threat to your throne, Robert. He is a boy. He is a boy with a claim. Blood carries claims, whether the blood wants them or not. Any lord with ambition and a grudge can rally behind a Targaryen heir. Varys, the spider, he's been whispering about Targaryen restoration for years. What happens when he learns there's a Targaryen living in Winterfell? What happens when the boy is 16, 18, 20, old enough to hold a sword and carry a banner? He won't. You don't know that. You don't know what he'll become. You don't know what men will make of him. I know what Targaryens become, Ned. I killed one. I watched another burn people alive for amusement. Their blood is poison, and it has been inside your walls for 14 years. The argument was not insane. That was what made it dangerous. Robert's fear had a foundation. Targaryen blood had historically attracted ambition, the way exposed steel attracted lightning. But the foundation supported a structure that culminated in the death of a child. And the distance between reasonable fear and the murder of a 14-year-old was a distance Robert was crossing without looking down. "I will not bring him to you," Ned said. "You can command it. You can send your Kingsguard, but you will have to go through me and through every man in Winterfell who carries a Stark sword. And the North will remember what you did here. The North remembers everything, Robert. That is the one thing you should have learned about us." Robert stared at Ned. The stare contained the warring pressures of a king's authority and a friend's disbelief. The incomprehension of a man discovering that the person he trusted most was choosing a dead man's son over their living bond. "You would defy me for his blood. I would keep a promise I made to my dying sister. I would protect an innocent boy. And I would prevent my oldest friend from becoming the kind of man who murders children. That is what Tywin Lannister does, Robert. That is what you despised him for. Rhaegar's other children, Rhaenys and Aegon, Tywin had them murdered. You stood in the throne room and looked at their bodies wrapped in Lannister cloaks and you said nothing. You let it happen. Do you want to be the man who orders it himself? The mention of the children hit Robert with a force that was visible. His face shifted, the battle mask cracking along fault lines that 14 years of denial had not fully sealed. He had seen the bodies. Alea's children. Small shapes under crimson cloth, presented as offerings to a new dynasty by a man whose definition of loyalty included infanticide. Robert had accepted those deaths because accepting them was easier than confronting them, and the acceptance had been sitting in his chest ever since, generating a pressure that Ned's words now released. That was different. It was not different. It was the same thing you were proposing now. A Targaryen child, killed because the blood in his veins frightens the man on the throne. The only difference is that this time you would have to give the order yourself instead of letting Tywin do it for you. Robert's hand closed into a fist, the injured one, the knuckles splitting again, blood seeping between fingers that wanted to hold a warhammer and find the kind of solution that warhammers provided. But there was no warhammer. There was no enemy to strike. There was only Ned Stark, standing between him and a boy who carried the blood of the man Robert hated most, and the obstacle was not one that violence could remove without destroying everything Robert valued about the man who stood in his way. "I need to think," Robert said. He walked away. The walk was heavy, deliberate, the gait of a man carrying a weight he had not been carrying an hour ago and would never fully set down. The Wolf's Promise Catelyn found Ned in the Lord's chamber that evening. He was seated at the desk, staring at nothing, and the staring had the quality of a man reviewing a disaster and finding that every response produced a different disaster. "The king didn't come to dinner," Catelyn said. "He sent Sir Barristan with his apologies. Cersei is asking questions. The household is noticing. Robert knows." Catelyn went still. "Knows what?" "About Jon." The two words occupied the room the way smoke occupies a closed space, filling every corner, changing the quality of the air. Catelyn's face moved through confusion to the edge of understanding and stopped there, because the understanding required information she did not have. "What about Jon?" Ned looked at his wife. 14 years. 14 years of watching her endure the presence of a boy she believed was his bastard. Endure it with the cold grace of a woman whose dignity would not permit outward cruelty, but whose heart had never forgiven the betrayal she thought the boy represented. 14 years of letting her suffer a lie because the truth was more dangerous than the suffering. "Jon is not my son." The sentence landed in the chamber and detonated. "He is my sister's son. Lyanna's." His father was Rhaegar Targaryen. Catelyn sat down. The motion was not voluntary. Her legs simply refused to continue supporting her weight under the load of what she had just heard. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at Ned with an expression that contained so many competing responses that none of them could achieve dominance. 14 years, she said. "I promised Lyanna." She was dying. She put the baby in my arms and she made me swear to protect him. If Robert had known, if anyone had known, the boy would have been killed. Robert had already allowed Rhaegar's other children to be murdered. I could not let that happen to Lyanna's son. 14 years. The repetition was not acknowledgement, it was the sound of a woman counting the cost. "I have spent 14 years believing you broke our marriage vows. I have spent 14 years hating that boy. I have looked at him across the dinner table and seen your betrayal looking back at me, and it was never. He was never." Her voice failed. Ned crossed the room to her. He knelt beside the bed and took her hands, and the gesture was the first honest contact between them on this subject in 14 years. The first time the truth existed in the same space as their marriage. "I could not tell you. If you had known, your behavior toward Jon would have changed. The household would have noticed. Questions would have been asked. The only way to keep the secret was for everyone, including you, to believe the lie. You chose your sister's dead child over your living wife's peace. I chose to keep a promise that kept a boy alive. and you chose to let me carry the weight of that promise without knowing I was carrying it." Ned had no answer for this, because the accusation was accurate. He had distributed the cost of Lyanna's secret across every relationship in his life, and Catelyn had paid the largest share, 14 years of resentment toward an innocent boy. 14 years of believing her husband was capable of the one dishonor she could not forgive. 14 years of a wound that had never healed because the wound was based on a fiction, and fictions do not generate the closure that truth provides. "Robert wants him dead," Ned said. Catelyn's expression changed. The personal wound, still raw, still spreading, was pushed aside by the maternal calculation of a woman who had raised 5 children and who responded to the threat of violence against any child with an urgency that transcended her own grief. "He can't have him." "No, he can't." "What will you do?" "What I must." The boy Jon was in the armory cleaning swords when Ned found him. The task was routine, a bastard's work, below the true-born sons and above the servants, occupying the middle ground that Jon had inhabited for his entire life without complaint and without understanding. "Walk with me," Ned said. They walked the upper battlements, father and nephew, though only one of them carried both identities. The sun was setting behind the wolfswood, painting the sky in colors that the north produced grudgingly, and that Jon had always loved for their rarity. "The king is angry," Jon said. Not a question. He had been observing, the way bastards observe from the margins, noting the tensions that legitimate members of the household were too centrally positioned to see. "He is. Because of me." Ned stopped walking. He turned to face the boy, Lyanna's boy, Rhaegar's boy, the child whose existence was the last act of a love story that had started a war and ended in blood. Jon stood before him with the stark face and the grey eyes and the quiet composure that Ned had always attributed to the north, but that might have come from somewhere else entirely. From a man who played the harp and read prophecy and rode into battle with a melancholy that his enemies mistook for weakness. "Jon, what I am about to tell you will change what you believe about yourself. I need you to listen. I'm listening. You are not my son." Jon's face did not move. The stillness was not composure. It was the body's response to information so large that the usual mechanisms of reaction could not process it fast enough to produce expression. He stood on the battlement in the dying light and received the words the way stone receives a blow, absorbing the impact without visible deformation, the damage happening internally, in places that would not show until later. "You are my sister's son, Lyanna Stark's son. Your father was Rhaegar Targaryen. The name that every child in the 7 kingdoms learned as a villain's name, the prince who stole the she-wolf, the dragon who started a war, the man Robert Baratheon killed at the Trident with a warhammer blow that scattered rubies across the ford. That name applied to the space where father should have been. You found my mother in a tower in Dawn," Jon said. The sentence was constructed from fragments he had been collecting for years, overhead conversations, half-answers, the geography of his fathers, his uncles, evasions. "She was dying. She put you in my arms. She made me promise to protect you. Robert would have had you killed if he had known. I brought you home and called you my bastard, and I have kept that secret for 14 years. Jon turned to look out over Winterfell. The castle spread below them. The keep, the great hall, the godswood, the practice yard where he had trained beside a brother who was actually a cousin. The geography of his entire life, suddenly rearranged by a single piece of information that changed nothing about the stones and everything about the boy who had grown up among them. My name isn't Jon Snow. Your mother named you Aegon. I called you Jon, after Jon Arryn, the man who raised Robert and me. I wanted you to carry the name of a good man, Aegon." The word sat strangely in his mouth, a Targaryen syllable spoken in a northern accent, belonging to a history he had never been told was his. Rhaegar already had a son named Aegon. I didn't learn that until later. Jon processed this. The processing was visible, not as emotion, but as reorganization, the rapid reassembly of a life's narrative using new information that contradicted the foundational assumption every other belief had been built upon. He was not Ned Stark's bastard. He was Lyanna Stark's son. He was Rhaegar Targaryen's heir. He was the reason 3 Kingsguard had died in a tower. He was the reason the most honorable man in the North had carried a lie for 14 years. "Lady Stark," Jon said. "She hated me because she thought I was proof of your dishonor. Yes, and you let her. The lie required it. You let her hate me to keep me alive." Ned said nothing. There was nothing to say. The arithmetic was correct. The cost had been distributed across Jon's childhood. 14 years of cold looks and withheld affection from the only mother figure in his life. 14 years of being the stain on Eddard Stark's honor. 14 years of carrying a name that marked him as less than his siblings in the one household where he should have been safe. "The king wants me dead," Jon said. "Yes, because of who my father was. Because of what your blood represents, not who you are, what men might make of you." Jon stood on the battlement and looked north, past the walls, past the Wolfswood, toward the horizon where the wall stood 700 feet tall and the Night's Watch kept its vigil. He had been planning to take the Black. Uncle Benjen had told him about the watch, the honor, the duty, the equality of men who surrendered their names and their claims for the shared purpose of guarding the realm. Jon Snow could take the Black, and no one would question it. Could the son of Rhaegar Targaryen? "What do I do?" Jon asked. "For now, nothing. I will handle Robert. You stay in Winterfell. You stay alive. And after?" Ned did not have an answer for after. After was a country he could not yet see the borders of, shaped by decisions that had not been made by men whose reactions he could not predict. After depended on whether Robert's rage or Robert's friendship proved stronger, and that contest had not yet been decided. "I'll tell you when I know," Ned said. They stood together on the battlement as the sun finished setting and the north went dark. Below them, Winterfell's torches flickered to life, and the castle that had been Jon's home for 14 years looked the same as it always had. The same stones, the same walls, the same wolves carved into every lintel and every gate. Everything was the same. Everything was different. And the difference was a name that Jon would carry for the rest of his life, whether anyone spoke it aloud or not. The gift Arya found Jon in the armory the night before Robert's departure. She did not know what had happened in the Godswood. The children had been told nothing. Protected by the same instinct that made Ned shield information from anyone whose safety depended on ignorance. But Arya noticed what the other children missed, because noticing was Arya's primary skill, and the thing she noticed was that Jon had stopped smiling. Not that Jon smiled often. He was not a boy built for easy joy. The bastard's awareness of his own position had taught him to modulate his expressions the way a servant modulates his voice, keeping the volume appropriate to his station. But the absence of the small, private smiles he reserved for Arya was different. Those smiles were currency between them, the acknowledgement of a bond that existed outside the hierarchy of the Stark household. Where Arya was the youngest daughter and Jon was the bastard, and neither of them fit the roles their names assigned them. "You're leaving," Arya said. Jon looked up from the sword he was wrapping in oiled cloth. "Who told you?" "Nobody told me. Nobody tells me anything. I heard father arguing with Jory about an escort north. I heard Lady Stark say something about Castle Black. I'm not stupid, Jon. I never said you were. You're going to the wall." Yes, Arya sat on a crate of practice shields and studied her brother, her cousin, though she did not know this yet, and the distinction would not have mattered to her if she had. Blood was irrelevant to Arya's attachments. She loved Jon because Jon treated her as a person rather than a category, because Jon laughed at her jokes and admired her stubbornness, and never once suggested that being a girl should limit what she was allowed to become. "Take me with you. The Watch doesn't accept girls. Then I'll dress as a boy. I'm flat-chested, and I can already pass for Arya. I can fight. Syrio says I'm improving. I'm faster than half the boys in the yard. I'm smarter than all of them. The wall needs fighters, and I can fight. The wall needs men who've taken an oath. The oath is forever. You're 9 years old. So? You're 14. 15, my name day passed. I missed your name day? The discovery produced genuine distress. The outrage of a girl whose emotional priorities were completely intact, despite her social ones being in permanent disarray. Nobody told me. I don't know what I would have done. Made you something. Jon set down the sword he was wrapping and crossed the armory to a trunk against the wall. He opened it and withdrew a long, thin parcel wrapped in leather. The parcel was light, far lighter than any weapon he would carry, and the wrapping was new, purchased from the castle's leather stores. I had this made for you. Arya took the parcel and unwrapped it. Inside was a sword. Not a wooden practice sword, but a real blade, castle forged, slender as a needle, designed for a grip smaller than a man's. The steel was good, not Valyrian, but well-tempered, with a balance that placed the weapon's center of gravity at the exact point where a small hand could control the edge with precision. It's a Braavosi water dancer's sword, Jon said. Mikken forged it to my instructions. I told him it was for me, that I wanted a lighter blade for speed work. He didn't ask questions. Arya held the sword. The grip fit her hand the way her hand fit itself, perfectly, as if the weapon had been built around her bones rather than her bones around the weapon. It needs a name, Jon said. All the best swords have names. Arya lifted the blade. The point was sharp, real steel, real edge, a weapon capable of killing rather than an ornament designed to look like one. She turned it in the armory's lamplight and watched the edge catch and throw back the flame. Needle, she said. Jon's mouth curved. The smile was not the absent smiles she had been missing. It was something else, a smile with weight behind it, the expression of a young man who was about to leave everything he loved and who was giving his favorite person in the world the only gift he could think of that was simultaneously practical and sentimental. Needle, he repeated. Good, Jon. Arya's voice shifted, the playfulness dropping away, replaced by something rawer. Why are you really going? You talked about the watch before, but it was always someday. Now it's tomorrow. What happened? I can't tell you. Because father said not to? Because telling you would put you in a position I don't want you in. Arya considered this with the focused attention of a girl who processed information the way her wolf processed scent. Rapidly, instinctively, arriving at conclusions that older and more cautious minds reached through deliberation. It's about the king. Something between father and the king. Something about you. Jon said nothing. The silence was itself an answer, and Arya read it the way she read all of Jon's silences, as confirmation, delivered in the language they had developed over 9 years of being the household's two misfits. You're not in trouble, Arya said. Not a question. I'm not in trouble. But you have to go. I have to go. She held Needle against her chest, the blade flat, the point toward the ceiling. The sword pressed against her body the way another girl might press a doll or a keepsake. The gesture was Arya's version of an embrace, the acceptance of a gift that was simultaneously a weapon and a farewell. First lesson, Jon said. Stick them with the pointy end. Arya laughed. The laugh was unexpected, bright and sharp in the dim armory. The sound of a girl whose brother was leaving and who was choosing, in the face of that loss, to laugh rather than cry, because crying was what ladies did and Arya Stark was not a lady. I'll remember, she said. Jon pulled her into a hug. The hug was fierce, the grip of a boy who was about to travel 1,000 miles north to live on a wall of ice and who was holding, in this armory, the last uncomplicated relationship in his life. Everything else, his parentage, his name, his future, was mired in politics and danger and the accumulated consequences of a love affair that had started before he was born. But Arya was simple. Arya was true. Arya loved him without condition and without complication, and the love was the one thing he could take to the wall that no oath could diminish. Don't let them make you into something you're not, Jon told her. Don't let them make you into something you're not, Arya replied. They separated. Arya held Needle at her side, the sword's weight comfortable, its presence already altering her posture. The weapon becoming part of her body as weapons become part of the people who carry them with purpose. Jon returned to his packing. The armory was silent, except for the sound of leather and steel and the distant howl of a wolf somewhere in the night. Ooh, ooh, ooh. The brother Rob found out because Rob was observant, and because 14-year-old boys who grow up together develop a sensitivity to each other's internal weather that no amount of concealment can defeat. He cornered Jon in the practice yard on the second day after the Godswood, the day the household went quiet. The day the king stopped appearing at meals. The day something large and invisible settled over Winterfell like a storm system that produced pressure without producing rain. What happened? Nothing. You're a terrible liar, Jon. You always have been. Father's a terrible liar, and you're worse. Something happened with the king, and you're at the center of it, and everyone in the castle is walking around like someone died. Jon's hand rested on the wooden practice sword he had been using. The grip was tight, the involuntary compression of a boy holding something solid while everything else shifted beneath his feet. Ask father. I'm asking you. The yard was empty. Morning training had ended, and the usual traffic of guards and servants had thinned to the occasional passing figure. They stood in the center of the packed earth, where they had spent 1,000 mornings fighting each other with wood and steel, learning the craft that their father, their uncle, had insisted every boy in Winterfell master, regardless of birth status. I'm not your brother, Jon said. Rob's face did not change. The not changing was its own reaction, the deliberate maintenance of composure in the face of a statement that should have produced confusion, surprise, or denial. Instead, Rob held steady and waited for the rest. I'm Uncle Ned's nephew. My mother was Lyanna Stark. My father was Rhaegar Targaryen. The information occupied the space between them. Rob processed it, not with the emotional devastation that Jon had experienced, because Rob's identity was not the one being demolished, but with the rapid recalculation of a boy whose entire framework for understanding his family had just been reorganized. Rhaegar, Rob said. Yes, the one Robert killed at the Trident. Yes, and father, Uncle Ned, brought you home and said you were his bastard. To protect me from Robert. If Robert had known, he would have had me killed. He did have Rhaegar's other children killed, the ones in King's Landing. Rob absorbed this. The absorption was visible in the way his jaw worked and his eyes moved, the physical symptoms of a mind running calculations at a speed that the body's stillness could not hide. He was 14, the same age as Jon, and the shared age meant that the processing happened at the same frequency, fast, without the cushioning that adult experience provides. The information arriving raw and being integrated raw. That's why the king is angry, he found out. In the Godswood, father couldn't lie anymore. And that's why you're going to the wall. Jon looked at Rob. The look was the look of two boys who had shared everything. A house, a table, a practice yard, a childhood, and who were now discovering that the sharing had been built on a foundation neither of them had been told about. The king wants me dead. The wall is the only place where my blood doesn't matter. Your blood has never mattered to me. The sentence arrived without hesitation. The immediate, unreflected response of a boy who had grown up treating Jon as a brother and who refused, in the face of new information, to recategorize the relationship. Jon was his brother. The biology was irrelevant. The politics were irrelevant. The name, Targaryen, Snow, Stark, whatever name the boy carried, was irrelevant. Rob's attachment was to the person, not the category, and the person had not changed. You're my brother, Rob said. My cousin, if we're being technical about it, but I don't care about technical. I care about the boy who trained with me every morning and beat me 3 times out of 5 and never once rubbed it in, because you're too bloody honorable. Which, by the way, makes you more of a Stark than half the trueborn sons in the north. Rob, I'm not finished. Rob stepped forward. The step was the physical assertion of a boy who would grow into a man who led armies, whose instinct for command was already present at 14, even if the occasion for its exercise had not yet arrived. You are my brother, whatever name they gave you, whatever blood you carry, whatever the king thinks you represent, you are my brother, and the North does not abandon its brothers. Jon's composure held. It had been holding for 2 days, the sustained effort of a young man maintaining his surface while everything beneath it was being rebuilt from new materials. But Rob's words found the seam, not the grand declarations, not the promises of loyalty or the assertions of brotherhood. The seam was in the small observation, never once rubbed it in. The acknowledgement of a detail so minor that only someone who had lived alongside Jon for 14 years would have noticed it, and the noticing was proof that the brotherhood Rob was claiming was not a gesture, but a history. "You should go before Father comes looking," Jon said. "Father can wait." "Rob, seriously, if anyone sees you talking to me with that expression on your face, they'll know something's wrong, and the fewer people who know about this, the safer everyone is. Let me come with you. To the wall? Wherever. I'll ride with the escort. I'll see you to Castle Black. I don't know. I'll do something. I'm not standing in the yard watching you ride away without doing something. You're the heir to Winterfell. You stay here. You learn to govern. You become what Father, what Uncle Ned trained you to become. That's what you do." Rob's face worked. The working was the struggle of a boy who wanted to act and who was being told, correctly, that the most useful action was inaction. That the best thing he could do for his brother was to remain in Winterfell and become the lord the North would need when the consequences of Jon's revelation finished rippling through the political landscape. "I hate this," Rob said. "I know. Write to me, from the wall. Write every week. I want to know you're alive, and I want to know what happens. And I want to know if anyone, threatens you. Because I will ride north, and I'll write." They stood in the practice yard, 2 boys who had been brothers and who were learning, in the cold light of a northern morning. That brotherhood was a choice rather than a circumstance, and that the choice, once made, was stronger than the circumstance it replaced. The morning sun cast their shadows across the packed earth, 2 long shapes pointing west, stretching toward a horizon that they would, from this day forward, view from opposite ends of the largest kingdom in the known world. Rob extended his hand. Jon took it. The handshake was brief and crushing, and entirely insufficient to contain what it was meant to express. But it was what they had, and they took it, and the taking was enough. "Winter is coming," Rob said. "Winter is coming," Jon replied. The words were the Stark words, the family motto, the warning, the promise. Jon had spoken them his entire life as a Stark, and he spoke them now as whatever he was becoming, and the words sounded the same, because the words did not care about blood. The words cared about the North. And the North, for a few more days at least, was still Jon's home. The Queen's opportunity, Cersei heard the shouting from the godswood. She did not hear the words. The distance and the walls reduced them to texture, but she recognized the timber. Robert in a rage. Robert screaming with the full force of a man whose emotional register had 2 settings, jovial indifference and volcanic fury. She had lived with both for 14 years and had learned to read each one's distinct threat. This was different from his usual rages. Those were directed at servants, at counselors, at the general inadequacy of a world that had failed to remain the war-era paradise Robert remembered. This rage was aimed at Ned Stark, and Robert did not rage at Ned Stark. Robert loved Ned Stark with the uncomplicated devotion of a man who had exactly one friendship he considered sacred. Something had broken. Cersei sent a servant to observe, not directly, but through the network of household staff, whose cooperation she maintained through small gifts and smaller threats. The servant returned with fragments, raised voices in the godswood, the king striking a tree, blood on his hand, the word Targaryen audible at the edge of earshot. Targaryen. Cersei assembled the fragments as she assembled all information, through the lens of what served her interests and what threatened them. Robert and Ned had quarreled about Targaryens. The quarrel was severe enough to produce violence and blood. The quarrel had occurred the day after Robert watched the Stark bastards spar in the practice yard and asked questions about the boy's mother. The conclusion formed with the precision of a key entering a lock. The bastard. The bastard was not a bastard. The bastard was a Targaryen. Cersei sat in her chambers in Winterfell and considered this information with the attentive stillness of a predator identifying a shift in the landscape. The Stark-Baratheon alliance was the foundation on which Robert's kingdom stood. Ned was Robert's conscience, his anchor, the man whose judgment Robert trusted above all others. If that alliance cracked, if the trust between them shattered, the foundation collapsed. And onto the rubble, other structures could be built. She wrote a letter to her father. The letter was brief, factual, and devastating in its implications. Robert has discovered that Ned Stark's bastard is the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. The king is enraged. Stark is defiant. The alliance is fracturing. Advise, she sealed the letter with Lannister gold wax and gave it to a rider with instructions to travel fast and speak to no one. Then she sat by the window of her guest chamber and watched the torches of Winterfell and thought about what a kingdom looked like when the two men holding it together could no longer stand in the same room. It looked like opportunity. The departure 3 days passed in silence, a silence so absolute that it replaced the noise of a royal visit with a tension that affected the entire castle. Robert did not attend meals. He did not hunt. He did not emerge from the king's guest chambers except for brief walks in the yard, accompanied by Sir Barristan, during which he spoke to no one and looked at nothing except the ground in front of his feet. On the fourth morning, Robert summoned Ned to the guest hall. Sir Barristan stood at the door. Inside, the king sat at a table bearing the remains of a breakfast he had not eaten and a bottle of Arbor Gold he had emptied. "I'm leaving," Robert said. "Today, the Queen, the children, the Kingsguard, all of it. We ride south." "Robert, I came here to make you my hand. That offer is withdrawn. You have chosen to protect a Targaryen over your duty to your king. I will not have a hand whose loyalty divides between the crown and a dead man's bloodline." Ned stood at the table. The room was cold. Winterfell's guest chambers were heated by hot springs channeled through the walls, but the heating had not kept pace with the season, and the chill in the stone matched the chill in Robert's voice. "The boy remains a threat," Robert continued. "A Targaryen heir in the household of the Warden of the North is an invitation to every ambitious lord, every Targaryen loyalist, every foreign power that sees advantage in destabilizing my reign. I am informing you, as your king, that Jon Snow, or whatever his name is, must be surrendered to the crown within 30 days. No, then I will come for him. You will not find the North a cooperative host." Robert stood. The standing was slow, the movement of a man whose body ached and whose spirit ached more. He crossed to the window and looked out at Winterfell's courtyard, where his men were already assembling for departure, horses being led from the stables, the wheelhouse being provisioned for the long road south. "I would have made you the second most powerful man in the Seven Kingdoms," Robert said. "I would have put my trust in you above every lord, every knight, every counselor. You were the brother I chose when the gods gave me brothers I couldn't stand. I know. And you chose him. You chose Rhaegar's ghost over 30 years of brotherhood. I chose a child's life over a grown man's rage." Robert turned from the window. For a moment, so brief that neither man could later agree on whether it had happened, something moved across Robert's face that was not anger and not grief, but something older than both. The last reflex of a friendship trying to survive the wound that was killing it. 30 days. Ned. After that, the crown will act. He left the room. Ned heard the sound of boots on stone, orders being shouted in the courtyard, horses being mounted. Within 2 hours, the royal procession was assembled, diminished, tight, moving with the efficiency of a party that wanted distance from its host. Cersei's wheelhouse rolled through the gates with the green and gold curtains drawn. The Kingsguard rode in formation. Robert sat his horse at the column's head, his back to Winterfell, his face pointed south. He did not look back. Ned watched from the battlements until the column disappeared into the Wolfswood. Beside him, Catelyn stood with her hands on the stone, her face composed in the controlled expression of a woman who was managing 3 crises at once: the political, the personal, and the 14-year fraud that had just been revealed as the foundation of her husband's apparent dishonor. "He'll send men," Catelyn said. He might. He will. Robert doesn't make threats he doesn't intend to carry out. It's the one quality he shares with your father. When a Stark or a Baratheon says a thing will happen, the thing happens. Then we prepare. Ned, Catelyn turned to him. The morning light showed the strain in her face, the accumulated damage of 4 days that had restructured her marriage, her family, and her understanding of both. We need allies. Robert is still the king. If the crown marches north, the north alone may not be enough. I know. Your father's bannerman. Hoster. My father. The Tullys can hold the Riverlands if it comes to that. And Stannis sits on Dragonstone with the royal fleet and a grievance against Robert that 15 years of overlooked service has sharpened to a point. You're describing a war. I'm describing what Robert is forcing by threatening your nephew's life. The word, nephew, landed between them with a weight that was still settling. Jon was Ned's nephew, not his son. The reconfiguration of that relationship was producing consequences that neither of them had begun to fully map. Call the banners, Catelyn said. Not for war, for counsel. Let your lords know what has happened. Let them decide with you. Who? The North remembers the Ravens went out that afternoon to Last Hearth, to the Dreadfort, to Carhold, to White Harbour, to every major holdfast between the Wall and the Neck. The messages were identical. The king in the north requires his bannerman at Winterfell. A matter of urgency. The title was not accidental. Ned had not used it. King in the north belonged to a different era. Before the Targaryens, before the conquest, before the north bent the knee. But the Ravens carried the weight of what was happening, whether the words said it explicitly or not. The Warden of the North was calling his lords because the king in the south had declared a threat against his house. They came within the fortnight. The great Jon Umber arrived first, riding hard from Last Hearth with 50 men. His enormous frame filling the doorway of the great hall, with the energy of a man who considered a summons from Winterfell the most exciting event of any given year. Roose Bolton arrived with fewer men and less noise, the lord of the Dreadfort entering Winterfell with the controlled silence of a man who gathered information before offering opinions, and who offered opinions only when the offering served his interests. Rickard Karstark came from Carhold with his sons Harrion and Torren. The Manderleys sent Wyman's son Wylis. The Mormonts, the Glovers, the Toolhearts, they came in groups and pairs and solitary rides, filling Winterfell's guest quarters and spilling into the winter town. Ned gathered them in the Great Hall. 37 lords and heirs, representing the full military strength of the North. A force that could field 20,000 men if called, and that had not been fully assembled since the Greyjoy Rebellion. He told them the truth. The telling took less time than he expected. The facts were simple. A promise to a dying sister, a baby carried home and called a bastard. 14 years of deception that had kept the boy alive and the realm at peace. The simplicity was its own defense. The most honorable man in the North had dishonored himself to protect an innocent child. The logic required no elaboration. The reactions filled the hall. The Great Jon erupted first, as the Great Jon always erupted, volume preceding content. So the king wants to murder a boy over who his father was? Let him try. Let him bring his southern army north and see what the Snows do to men who aren't bred for them. This is not a matter for bluster, Roose Bolton said. His voice was the opposite of the Great Jon's, so quiet that the hall had to fall silent to hear it, which was precisely the effect Roose intended. The question is not whether we can resist the crown. The question is whether we should. Lord Stark has harbored a Targaryen heir for 14 years. Some would call that treason. Some would call it mercy, Mage Mormont replied from the Bear Island contingent. A baby, Lord Bolton. A baby in his dead mother's blood. Should he have left it to die? I am not arguing the morality. I am observing the political reality. Robert Baratheon will frame this as treason. The lords south of the Neck will believe him. The North will stand alone. The North has stood alone before, said Wyman Manderley's son Wylis, speaking with the careful diplomacy of a house that controlled the North's largest port and understood trade politics better than any other Stark bannerman. But Lord Bolton raises a fair concern. Standing alone means fighting alone if Robert calls his banners. Ned let them talk. The debate was necessary, 37 lords processing the same information at different speeds, reaching different conclusions based on different calculations. The Greatjon and the Mormont saw honour and duty and the reflexive northern resistance to southern authority. Bolton saw risk. The Manderleys saw economics. A war with the Crown would close the trade routes through White Harbour. The Karstarks saw a fight and were broadly in favour of it. Rickard Karstark stood. "My lord, I'll say what others are dancing around. The boy, does he have a claim?" "He has blood," Ned said. "Whether that constitutes a claim depends on whether anyone advances it. Do you intend to advance it?" "No, Jon does not want the throne. He wanted to take the Black." "Then send him to the Wall," Bolton said. "The Night's Watch takes no part in the wars of the realm. A man who takes the Black renounces all claims, all titles, all inheritance. Jon Snow becomes a brother of the Watch, and Robert has no cause for war." The suggestion cut through the noise. It was pragmatic. It was clean. It solved the immediate problem, removed Jon from the political board, neutralized the threat Robert perceived, and preserved the peace between North and South. It also condemned a 14-year-old boy to a lifetime of exile at the edge of the world because of who his parents were. "The Wall is an option," Ned said. "But the boy has not yet decided, and the decision should be his, not Robert's." "With respect, my lord," Bolton replied, "the boy's preferences are less important than the survival of the North. If Robert marches, people die. Northern people. Our sons. Our soldiers. The Wall removes the cause of war. The boy's consent is desirable, but not necessary." The Greatjon slammed his fist on the table. "You want us to send a boy to freeze on the Wall because the fat king in the south can't control his temper? What kind of northerners are we?" "Living ones," Bolton answered. The debate continued through the afternoon and into the evening. By the time the torches were lit, a rough consensus had emerged. Not unanimous, not clean, but sufficient. The North would not surrender Jon to Robert. The Wall remained an option, but not an ultimatum. Ned would send a raven to Robert proposing terms. Jon takes the Black voluntarily, renouncing all claims. In exchange, Robert withdraws his threat, and the alliance is preserved. It was a compromise. It satisfied no one completely. It was, like most functional agreements between proud men with competing interests, the least objectionable of several bad options. The road south Robert Baratheon's mood on the King's Road could be measured by the distance his escort maintained. On a good day, the outriders stayed within earshot. On a bad day, they gave him a quarter mile. On the worst days, and the worst days had begun at Winterfell and showed no sign of ending, they dropped back far enough that his shouting was reduced to a distant vibration, the rage reaching them as weather rather than language. Cersei rode in the wheelhouse and waited. She was patient, as predators are patient. Not passive, but attentive, tracking the trajectory of her husband's fury and calculating when it would arc from destructive to useful. On the 5th day of travel, Robert summoned her. The summoning was unusual. Robert communicated with Cersei through obligation rather than desire, state dinners, public appearances, the occasional marital encounter that neither party enjoyed and both parties endured for reasons that had nothing to do with affection. A private summons meant Robert needed something he could not get from his guards. His wineskin, or his own company. "You heard," Robert said. Not a question. He sat on a camp stool in the royal tent, his camp cup filled with wine, his eyes carrying the bloodshot evidence of several days' sustained drinking. "I heard fragments. I would like to hear the rest." Robert told her. Not everything, not the personal anguish, not the conversation in the Godswood, not the way Ned's silence had said what Ned's voice would not. He told her the facts. The bastard was Rhaegar's son. Ned had lied. The alliance was broken. Cersei listened with the composed attention of a woman receiving confirmation of a theory she had already constructed. When Robert finished, she said nothing for a count of 10, long enough for Robert to feel the silence as an absence and to need it filled. "What will you do?" she asked. I gave him 30 days. After that, I'll send men. Men Ned Stark will resist. The North is loyal to the Starks the way the Westerlands are loyal to my father. Generations of service producing an allegiance that no king can override from a distance. Send 100 men, and the North swallows them. Send 1,000, and the North fights. Send 10,000, and you have a war. Then, I'll have a war. A war over a bastard boy who doesn't know his own parentage and has no army, no allies, and no ambition beyond apparently joining the Night's Watch. This is the war you want? This is the war Ned Stark has chosen by harboring a Targaryen. Cersei leaned forward. The motion was calculated, closing the distance between them to the range where her voice became intimate, her presence became advisory, her influence became indistinguishable from counsel. Or, you allow me to write to my father. Tywin Lannister has solved problems like this before. Cleanly, without armies, without wars, without the realm ever learning what happened or why. The suggestion sat in the tent. Robert stared at his wife, the wife he had never loved, the wife whose family he had never trusted, the wife who was offering him the services of the most ruthlessly efficient lord in the Seven Kingdoms to resolve a problem that Robert's own rage could not. You're suggesting assassination. I'm suggesting the practical alternative to a war you cannot afford, and a confrontation that will destroy whatever remains of your friendship with the most honorable man in Westeros. Robert drank. The drinking lasted several swallows, the measured consumption of a man using wine to delay a decision he was not ready to make. I'll think about it. Think quickly, 30 days is generous. In 30 days, the boy could be on a ship to Essos, or at the Wall, or anywhere Ned Stark decides to hide him. If you want this resolved, it must be resolved before Ned has time to make the boy unreachable. She left the tent. The camp sounds resumed. Horses, soldiers, the crackle of fires. Robert sat alone with his wine and Cersei's suggestion, and the image of a 14-year-old boy with Stark features and Targaryen blood, who was, at this moment, alive in Winterfell because the man Robert loved had chosen a dead woman's promise over a living man's authority. The broken man on the 10th day of the ride south. Robert stopped the column at a village inn and drank for 6 hours. This was not unusual behavior for the king. What was unusual was the quality of the drinking, not the boisterous social consumption that Robert deployed at feasts and hunts, but the solitary, deliberate intake of a man using wine the way a surgeon uses a blade to cut away something that hurt. He sat at a corner table in the inn's common room, his guards positioned at the door, his crown stored in the wagon, his face carrying the raw expression of a man whose defenses had been stripped and who had not yet built new ones. Sir Barristan Selmy stood at the wall. The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard had served 3 kings, Aerys, Robert, and the interregnum between them, and had watched all 3 in their worst moments. Aerys burning men alive, Robert at the trident, hammer swinging with a fury that transcended military necessity. And now, Robert in a common room in a village without a name, drinking with the focused determination of a man trying to outrun a truth that ran faster. Sir Barristan, Your Grace, you served Rhaegar. The statement arrived without context and with total context, the kind of statement Robert made when the wine had dissolved the barriers between his conscious thoughts and his mouth. I served the Kingsguard. Prince Rhaegar was the heir to the throne I was sworn to protect. You liked him. He was a good man, Your Grace. Whatever else he was, whatever the politics, Rhaegar was a good man. That is not a comfortable thing to say in your presence, but you asked, and I will not lie to you. Robert drank. The drinking absorbed the statement as sand absorbs water, taking it in, holding it, allowing it to settle into the substrate. He was a good man who stole my betrothed. He was a man who loved a woman, Your Grace. The politics of how love intersects with duty is a subject I am not qualified to judge. She loved him back. Did you know that? Barristan's face revealed nothing. The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard was trained to reveal nothing. The white cloak was meant to produce men whose faces were as blank as their shields. I suspected, Your Grace. Everyone suspected. Everyone knew. Everyone except me, the man who fought a war over it, the man who killed him, the man who sat the throne he built on her bones. Robert set down the cup. The setting down was deliberate, the deliberation of a man approaching a statement he had been building for 10 days and 1,200 miles. The rebellion was a lie. Barristan, not the politics. The Targaryens were mad, and the realm needed change. But my part of it, my reason. I didn't fight to save Lyanna. I fought to get her back. And she didn't want to come back. She was in that tower because she chose to be there. She chose Rhaegar. She chose the Dragon Prince with the silver hair and the sad songs over the Storm Lord with the warhammer and the appetite. Your Grace, don't console me. I'm not asking for comfort. I'm saying what happened, out loud for the first time. Because if I don't say it, I'll choke on it. Robert picked the cup back up. I loved a woman who didn't love me. I killed the man she loved. I built a kingdom on the lie that she was stolen. And the proof, the walking, breathing proof that everything I believed was wrong, has been living in my best friend's castle for 14 years, and my best friend lied to me to keep the proof alive because my best friend knew that if I found out, I would try to kill a child. The common room was empty, except for the two of them and the innkeeper, who had retreated to the kitchen with the survival instinct of a man who recognized when powerful people needed privacy. And the worst part, Barristan, the worst part, the part I cannot stop thinking about, is that Ned was right to lie. He was right. Because I did want to kill the boy. I looked at that boy, and I saw Rhaegar's blood, and I wanted him dead. And the wanting was real, and the wanting was wrong, and the fact that it was wrong did not make it smaller. I wanted to kill a 14-year-old boy, because his father stole the woman I loved. Except his father didn't steal her, she went willingly, and the boy didn't choose any of it, and the rage I feel isn't about him. It's about me. It's about being the man who lost. The man who fought a war and won a kingdom and still lost the only thing he ever wanted. Barristan stood at the wall and listened to the king's confession and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The truth Robert was speaking was the kind of truth that did not benefit from response. The raw disclosure of a man reaching the bottom of his grief and finding, at the bottom, the hard surface of self-knowledge that grief eventually produces. Robert finished the bottle. He set it on the table with the precise placement of a man whose fine motor control had been refined rather than destroyed by 6 hours of wine. The paradox of a serious drinker whose body had adapted to alcohol as a soldier's body adapts to armor. We ride in the morning, Robert said, and we do not speak of this again. No, Your Grace. Robert stood, steadied himself, and walked toward the stairs with the heavy, deliberate gait of a man who had set down a weight he had been carrying for 20 years, and who was now learning what it felt like to walk without it. The Maester's Council, Maester Luwin, found Ned in the Godswood after the Bannerman's meeting, seated beneath the weirwood, in the same spot where Robert had learned the truth, the disturbed earth still visible where Robert's boots had torn the moss. The lords are divided, Luwin said. He carried no torch, the moon was bright enough to navigate by, and the old Maester moved through Winterfell's grounds with the practiced confidence of a man who had walked them for 20 years. Bolton wants expediency. The Griachun wants war. Both positions have merit. Both positions end with Jon suffering for someone else's decision. Luwin sat on the root of the heart tree, an irreverence that Ned permitted because Luwin's counsel had earned every accommodation. My lord, I must speak to the political reality. Robert Baratheon is the king. His word is law south of the neck. If he declares Jon a traitor, or declares you a traitor for harboring him, every lord in the Seven Kingdoms faces a choice between supporting the crown and supporting the north. Most will support the crown. Not because they love Robert, but because defying the Iron Throne is a risk that few lords are willing to take for a boy they've never met. I know. The wall is the safest path. Jon takes the black, renounces his name, and Robert loses his justification. A man of the Night's Watch holds no lands, takes no wife, fathers no children. Jon becomes invisible, legally, politically, dynastically, Jon is 14 years old. The wall is a life sentence. The wall is a life, my lord. The alternative Robert is proposing is no life at all. Ned looked up at the weirwood. The face stared back, impassive, ancient, offering no guidance because the old gods did not guide. They witnessed. They remembered. They left the choosing to the men who prayed beneath them. There is another consideration, Lewin said. One you have not raised, which suggests you have already thought of it. Say it. Benjen, your brother serves at the wall. He is first ranger. Jon would not be alone there. He would have family. Not visible family. Not acknowledged family, but family nonetheless. And there is Maester Aemon. Ned turned. Aemon Targaryen. Born Aemon of House Targaryen, son of King Maekar, great uncle of the Mad King. He took his chain and then took the Black nearly 60 years ago. He has lived at Castle Black ever since. Blind now, ancient, but alive. He is Jon's great-great-uncle. The information settled over Ned. He had not thought of Aemon, the old maester at the wall, the last Targaryen in Westeros, save Jon, and whoever survived across the narrow sea. A man who had been offered the crown and refused it. A man who had watched his entire family destroy itself and had survived by stepping outside the game entirely. A Targaryen at the wall, Ned said. Living proof that the blood does not dictate the man. Precisely, Aemon chose duty over dynasty. Jon could make the same choice. The precedent exists. Ned sat with this. The wall was exile, frozen, permanent, stripping Jon of everything he might otherwise become. But the wall was also life, and life, in the calculus that Ned had been performing since Lyanna died in his arms, was the variable that outweighed all others. Draft the Raven to Robert, Ned said. Jon will take the Black. Voluntarily, not as a surrender to the crown, but as a choice made by a Stark of Winterfell. Robert gets his resolution. Jon gets his life. And the terms will state, clearly, that any action against Jon after he takes his vows is an attack on the Night's Watch, not on a Targaryen pretender. And, if Robert refuses the terms, then we discover whether 30 years of friendship can survive the weight of what I've told him. Lewin nodded. He rose from the root and bowed, the bow of a man who respected the decision even if the decision broke his heart, and walked back toward the castle, his chain clinking in the moonlight. Ned remained. The godswood was silent except for the wind in the leaves and the distant sound of wolves in the wolfswood. Ghost was among them, Jon's direwolf running with his wild cousins, white against the dark. Belonging to both worlds, and neither. The Raven would go south in the morning. The words would reach Robert in a fortnight. And then the king, who had once been a brother, would decide whether the boy who carried Targaryen blood deserved to live. And the answer would determine whether the friendship that had survived a war could survive a truth. The King's Court. Robert Baratheon entered King's Landing through the King's Gate 3 weeks after leaving Winterfell, and the city that greeted him was the same city he had left, crowded, stinking, indifferent to the personal crises of its ruler. The small folk did not know what had happened in the north. The lords of the court did not know. The small council did not know. All they saw was the king returning from Winterfell without the man he had gone to bring back as hand. The absence was noticed. Lord Stark declined the appointment. Grandmaster Pycelle inquired at the first council session, his voice carrying the practiced innocence of a man who had survived 4 kings by never appearing to understand anything faster than his masters wanted him to. Lord Stark and I have a disagreement, Robert said. The handship is unfilled. The realm requires a hand, your grace. The realm requires whatever I decide the realm requires. The council exchanged glances. Varys sat with his hands folded, his expression arranged in concern so precisely calibrated that it might have been painted on. Littlefinger occupied the Master of Coin's seat and watched Robert with the attentive stillness of a man reading a ledger that contained unfamiliar numbers. Renly sat at the far end of the table, young and handsome, and trying to determine whether the situation was concerning or advantageous. "I'll name a hand when I find a man I trust," Robert said. "The question is whether any such man exists." The bitterness landed on the table, and no one picked it up. After the council, Varys materialized beside Robert in the corridor, the approach so smooth and soundless that Robert had already begun walking before registering that the eunuch was at his elbow. "Your Grace." "What do you want, Spider?" "I want to offer my condolences regarding Lord Stark. The disagreement must have been severe." "It was, and I want to inform you, because informing you is my purpose, that the nature of your disagreement may not remain private for long." Cersei wrote to Lord Tywin from Winterfell. "The Raven arrived 3 days ago. Tywin's response will follow." Robert stopped walking. "You read Cersei's letters." "I am aware of Cersei's letters. The distinction is important." Varys's smile was the polite expression of a man who had built a career on the difference between knowledge and its disclosure. "Your Grace, whatever transpired in Winterfell regarding Lord Stark's household arrangements, the court will learn of it. The question is whether they learn of it through your framing or through someone else's. You know. I know many things, Your Grace, some of them for a very long time." Robert turned on the eunuch with a violence that the corridor's narrowness barely contained. "You knew. You knew about the boy." "How long?" "I had suspicions." "Suspicions are not knowledge. Knowledge requires confirmation, and confirmation regarding a child hidden in the north by the most private lord in the Seven Kingdoms is difficult to obtain." "Suspicions? You had suspicions that Ned Stark was harboring Rhaegar Targaryen's son, and you said nothing." "I said nothing because the boy was no threat. A bastard in Winterfell, raised as a northerner, dreaming of the Night's Watch. This is not the Targaryen restoration that should concern Your Grace. The Targaryens across the narrow sea, Viserys, his sister Daenerys, those are the active claims. Those are the names that ambitious men might rally behind. The boy in Winterfell is a secret that was doing no harm. Every Targaryen is a threat. Every Targaryen is a name. Names become threats when men with armies choose to carry them. No one was carrying the boy's name. No one will, if the situation is handled without spectacle." Robert stared at Varys. The Spider's Council was, like all of the Spider's Council, simultaneously useful and suspicious, the right advice delivered by a man whose motives were so layered that accepting his guidance always felt like walking a path someone else had paved. Handle it how? Let him take the black. A man of the Night's Watch is legally dead to the realm. His Targaryen blood becomes irrelevant. His name becomes irrelevant. The boy disappears into the Watch, and the secret dies with him. No war. No martyr. No rallying point for future rebellion. Ned will propose the same thing. Then you and Lord Stark agree, which means the disagreement can be resolved, which means the alliance can be preserved, which means the kingdom retains the stability that your friendship with Lord Stark has provided for 14 years. Varys paused. "Unless your Grace prefers war with the North to settling an old grievance. It is not an old grievance. It is a fresh betrayal. It is a 14-year-old secret revealed under circumstances that make the revelation more dangerous than the secret ever was. The boy was safe in Winterfell. The boy was invisible. Now the boy is the most important political fact in the Seven Kingdoms, and every lord, spy, and foreign agent will soon know he exists. The question is no longer whether the secret survives. The question is what happens now that it hasn't." Varys bowed and withdrew, his slippers silent on the stone floor, his departure as soundless as his arrival. Robert stood alone in the corridor of the Red Keep and listened to the distant sounds of a castle operating around a king whose kingdom was fracturing along a fault line that had been invisible for 14 years and was now the most prominent feature of the landscape. The Spider's calculation in his private chambers, a windowless room beneath the Red Keep that Varys maintained for conversations that the walls should not hear. The Master of Whisperers reviewed his position. The boy complicated things, not fatally, But the complication required adjustment. Across the narrow sea, Viserys Targaryen was attempting to sell his sister Daenerys to the Dothraki horse lord Khal Drogo in exchange for an army. The plan was crude, Viserys was crude, but the Dothraki were 40,000 mounted warriors, and the marriage would produce an alliance capable of crossing the sea if sufficient ships could be obtained. Illyrio Morpurtis, in Pentos, was financing the arrangement. The endgame was a Targaryen restoration, or at least the appearance of one, behind which other, more capable hands could govern. Jon Snow threatened this calculus. Not because the boy was dangerous, he was not, but because a confirmed Targaryen heir in Westeros, protected by the Starks, introduced a competing claim. If Viserys crossed the sea and found a Targaryen already present, the politics of restoration became a succession dispute rather than a liberation. 2 Targaryen claimants were worse than one. 3, if one counted Daenerys, were a civil war waiting for a venue. Varys required clarity. One Targaryen, properly managed, could unite the realm. Multiple Targaryens would divide it. And the one Varys had invested in, the one whose return he had been engineering for years, was not the boy in Winterfell. The boy needed to be neutralized without being eliminated. The Wall accomplished this. A man of the Night's Watch could not inherit, could not marry, could not hold lands. Jon Snow at the Wall was Jon Snow erased from the board. The Black Cloak was more permanent than a death. The dead could become martyrs, but the Night's Watch produced no martyrs. It produced forgotten men. Varys had counselled Robert toward the Wall for Robert's reasons. He counselled toward the Wall for his own reasons. The alignment was convenient. Convenient alignments were Varys's preferred operating environment, the place where self-interest and sound advice were indistinguishable. But Cersei was not aligned. Cersei wanted the boy dead, because Cersei thought in absolutes, threats existed or they didn't. And the only way to ensure a threat didn't exist was to ensure the person didn't exist. Tywin would agree. Tywin had solved the Targaryen problem at the sack of King's Landing by having Gregor Clegane murder Rhaegar's children in their beds. The method was effective. The method was Tywin. And the method was already in motion because Cersei had written to Casterly Rock and Tywin Lannister did not receive letters about Targaryen heirs without responding. Varys sent his own ravens through channels that did not pass through the rookery, using methods that Pycelle could not intercept. One to Illyrio, informing him of the development and recommending acceleration of the Dothraki time-eatable. One to an agent in the north with instructions to watch Winterfell and report Jon Snow's movements. And one to Benjen Stark at Castle Black, through a route that would make the letter appear to originate from Winterfell. The letter said, "Your nephew may soon come to the Wall. He will need a friend." Varys had not survived 4 kings by choosing sides. He had survived by ensuring that every possible outcome contained a version in which he remained useful. Boom. The Lion's agent Tywin Lannister's response to Cersei's letter arrived at King's Landing not as a raven, but as a man. Sir Mandon Moore of the Kingsguard received instructions through channels that traced back to Casterly Rock, though the instructions themselves bore no seal and no signature. Tywin's methods were precise. The instruction was simple. The Targaryen boy in Winterfell represented an unacceptable risk. The risk should be eliminated. Operational details were left to the agent's judgment, because Tywin trusted competence more than control, and because deniability required distance between the order and its execution. Sir Mandon was not the only instrument. A rider departed Casterly Rock bound for the Neck, a man without sigil or colours, carrying gold and a description, and the kind of patience that contract work required. The rider's instructions were contingent. If the Kingsguard route failed, or if the boy moved before Sir Mandon could act, alternative arrangements would ensure the outcome. Varys learned of both within 2 days. His network, the little birds, the whisperers, the servants and stable boys and dock workers who constituted the Spider's distributed intelligence, registered the departures and reported them through the channels that made Varys the best-informed man in Westeros. He considered intervening. The boy's death was not in his interest. A murdered Targaryen was a martyr. and martyrs generated exactly the kind of political energy that complicated foreign policy. But intervention required revealing his knowledge, and revealed knowledge was spent knowledge. Instead, he sent a message to Winterfell, not to Ned, to Catelyn Stark, through a trade contact in White Harbor, routed through 3 intermediaries to make the origin untraceable. The message was 4 words: the boy is hunted. Catelyn would interpret the warning correctly. She was a Tully, raised in the Riverlands political culture, fluent in the language of indirect communication, capable of understanding that a warning without attribution was still a warning. She would act, and her acting would protect the boy without requiring Varys to expose his own involvement. The board was in motion, pieces moving in 3 dimensions: Robert's rage from the south, Tywin's agents from the west, Varys's manipulations from beneath. And in Winterfell, a boy who did not yet understand the full weight of his own blood was preparing to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. The mother he never had, Catelyn, found Jon in the library. She had not sought him out in 14 years, had never initiated a conversation, never asked after his health, never performed any of the small maternal gestures that she distributed among her own children with the automatic generosity of a woman who considered motherhood her primary vocation. Jon was the exception. Jon was the stain. Jon was the evidence of her husband's single failure, and she had punished the evidence for the failure because the man who committed it was the man she loved, and the boy was the only available target for a resentment she could not direct at its source. And the evidence was a lie. The stain was manufactured. The boy she had punished for 14 years was innocent of the crime she had convicted him of. Innocent, not through blamelessness, but because the crime itself had never occurred. Ned had not betrayed her. Ned had betrayed her trust, which was different, and the difference was the distance between adultery and sacrifice, and the distance was vast, and Catelyn was still mapping it. Jon looked up when she entered. His face showed surprise, an expression she had rarely seen on him, because Jon's default in her presence was the guarded neutrality of a person accustomed to navigating a hostile environment without provoking the hostility. Lady Stark. Jon. The name, his name. The name she had spoken 100 times in 14 years with varying degrees of coldness, and never once with warmth, sat between them. Lord Stark told you, Jon said. He told me. She sat across from him. The library was empty, mid-afternoon, the household occupied with duties that did not include reading. The shelves rose around them, filled with histories of the North and the Seven Kingdoms and the Targaryens who had ruled both, and the irony of discussing Targaryen blood in a room filled with Targaryen history was the kind of irony that neither of them was in a position to appreciate. I owe you an explanation, Catelyn said, not an apology. An apology implies I could have behaved differently, and I could not, because I did not have the information that would have made different behavior possible. I was cruel to you because I believed you were proof of my husband's dishonor. I was wrong about the dishonor. I was not wrong about the cruelty, and the cruelty happened regardless of its cause. Jon absorbed this with the composure of someone who had been absorbing difficult information at an accelerating rate for several days, and whose capacity for surprise was approaching exhaustion. You hated me. I resented you. The distinction matters to me if it does not matter to you. It doesn't. The honesty was not hostile. It was the flat statement of a young man who had spent 14 years calibrating his own worth against the coldness of the woman who should have been his mother, and who was now sitting across from him, explaining that the calibration had been based on false data. I treated you as less than my children, because I believed you were evidence of something I could not forgive. You were not evidence. You were a child. And I treated a child with a coldness that I would have condemned in anyone else, and I did it for 14 years, and the years cannot be returned. No, they can't. Catelyn looked at him fully, without the filter of resentment that had colored every previous observation. The face was stark. The eyes were stark. The coloring, the build, the long solemn features, all stark. If she looked for Rhaegar, she could find traces, a hint in the bone structure, a quality in his stillness as if repose were a natural state rather than an effort. But these were traces, not declarations. Jon Snow, Jon Targaryen, looked like Ned's son because he looked like Ned's sister, and Lyanna had looked like Ned. And the blood bred true. "Your father loved your mother," Catelyn said. The sentence cost her something. The word father applied to Rhaegar, the word mother applied to Lyanna. The acknowledgement that the love which had started a war had also produced the boy sitting across from her. Ned told me the full account. The Tower. The Kingsguard. Her last words. Whatever Rhaegar Targaryen was, and the realm has its opinions, Lyanna chose him. And the choosing produced you. And Ned kept you alive, because he loved her, and because you were innocent, and because that is who Ned is. He lied to everyone. He lied to everyone to protect you. Including me. Including himself. The lie cost him his honor in the eyes of every person who heard it. Eddard Stark, the most honorable man in the North, let the world believe he fathered a bastard because the alternative was letting his sister's son be murdered by his best friend. The statement was the first time Catelyn had framed Ned's deception as sacrifice rather than betrayal, and the framing changed the shape of the story she had been carrying for 14 years. The lie was not Ned's weakness. The lie was Ned's most difficult act of strength, and the boy it protected was not the evidence of Ned's failure, but the proof of his capacity for a kind of devotion that transcended honor, marriage, friendship, and every other bond that Catelyn had believed was more important. "I can't give you back the years," Catelyn said, "but I can tell you this. You have a place in this family. Whatever happens, whatever Robert decides, whatever the realm demands, you are Lyanna's son. You are Ned's blood, and this house will not let you be taken from it." Jon's composure held, but something behind it shifted, a movement so small that only someone sitting at the distance Catelyn was sitting could have seen it. The movement was the beginning of something he had not been permitted to feel in her presence for 14 years. He said nothing. She did not require him to. She stood and left the library, and the sound of her footsteps on the stone was the sound of a door opening that had been closed since the day Ned Stark rode home from the war with a baby in his arms and a lie on his lips. The raven Ned's raven reached King's Landing 18 days after Robert's return. The letter was written in Ned's hand, the stark, unornamented script of a man who considered words tools rather than ornaments, and who used only as many as the task required. "Robert, Jon will take the black. He will go to the wall voluntarily and swear his oath to the Night's Watch. He will renounce all names, all claims, all inheritance. He will serve the realm in the only way that removes the threat you perceive without requiring the death of an innocent boy. This is my offer. It is not a surrender. It is a solution that preserves what can be preserved between us. If you cannot accept it, then what is broken cannot be mended, and we will both live with the consequences of that failure." Ned. Robert read the letter in his solar. He read it once, quickly, then again slowly, then a third time with his finger tracing each line as if the words were a terrain he was mapping. The wall. The bloody wall. 700 feet of ice at the end of the world, guarded by criminals and misfits, and the occasional Lord's son who had run out of options. Ned was offering to send Rhaegar Targaryen's heir to the most desolate posting in the Seven Kingdoms and call it a resolution. It was, Robert admitted in the part of his mind that still functioned when the rage subsided, a reasonable offer. A man of the Night's Watch was invisible to the realm. Jon Snow at the wall was Jon Snow erased. No claim, no title, no marriage, no children, no future that could threaten the Baratheon dynasty. The boy would serve and freeze and age and die at the edge of the world, and the Targaryen blood in his veins would end with him. But accepting the offer meant accepting that Ned had been right. Right to hide the boy, right to lie, right to choose a dead woman's promise over a living king's authority. Accepting meant conceding that the most important decision Ned Stark had made in 14 years, the decision to protect Rhaegar's son, was justified. And conceding that meant conceding something far more devastating, that Lyanna had not needed saving. That Lyanna had chosen Rhaegar, that the rebellion Robert had built his life on was fought for a woman who did not want to be fought for. That was the truth beneath the truth, and Robert could feel it pressing against the foundations of everything he had constructed since the Trident. He set the letter down. "Bring me wine," he told the servant at the door. The wine arrived. The drinking began. And the decision that would determine whether a boy lived at the Wall or died in the north, whether a friendship survived or fractured permanently, whether a king could bend without breaking, waited for a man who had never been good at waiting, and who was now being asked to wait for his own heart to catch up to his mind. The stag's brother Stannis Baratheon learned of the situation through a letter from Varys, a letter that arrived at Dragonstone by private courier, sealed with blank wax, written in the spider's distinctive hand, that managed to look both fastidious and urgent simultaneously. Stannis read the letter in his study at Dragonstone, the austere, windswept tower room he had chosen as his workspace, because it was the least comfortable room in the castle, and Stannis operated on the principle that comfort was the enemy of diligence. The painted table, Aegon the Conqueror's carved map of Westeros, spread beneath the letter. And the irony of reading about a Targaryen heir while sitting at a Targaryen artifact was the kind of irony that Stannis would have dismissed as meaningless, and that Renly would have made a joke about. The facts: Ned Stark's bastard was Rhaegar Targaryen's son. Robert had discovered the truth. The alliance was fracturing. The king had issued a 30-day ultimatum. Tywin Lannister, through Cersei, was maneuvering. Stannis absorbed the information as he absorbed all information, through the lens of law and duty, stripped of sentiment, processed with the mechanical efficiency of a mind that considered emotion a contaminant in decision-making. The legal position was complex. Jon Snow was by blood a Targaryen. If Rhaegar and Lyanna had married, and the Kingsguard's presence at the Tower of Joy suggested a legitimate union, since the Kingsguard protected the royal family, not mistresses, then Jon was not a bastard at all. He was a true-born Targaryen with a claim to the Iron Throne that predated Robert's conquest. Since Robert's claim rested on Targaryen overthrow rather than Targaryen extinction. If the Targaryens still had a legitimate heir, the legal foundation of the Baratheon dynasty was weakened. Not destroyed, conquest established its own legitimacy, and Robert's rule was 15 years old, supported by the great houses, ratified by coronation and governance. But a living Targaryen heir introduced a competing legal framework. Any lord dissatisfied with Baratheon rule could, in principle, advance Jon's claim as the legitimate alternative. This was why Robert wanted the boy dead. Stannis understood Robert's position. Understood it better, perhaps, than Robert himself. Because Stannis could articulate the legal reasoning that Robert could only feel as instinct. The boy was a threat not because of who he was, but because of what others could make of him. A banner, a rallying point, a legal pretext for rebellion dressed as restoration. But killing the boy was wrong. Not wrong in the moral sense. Stannis rarely troubled himself with moral categories when legal categories were available, but wrong in the political and legal sense. Murdering a child produced martyrs. Martyrs produced causes. Causes produced the very rebellion the murder was meant to prevent. Tywin Lannister had proven this at the sack of King's Landing. The murder of Rhaegar's children had not ended the Targaryen cause. It had driven it underground, where it festered in Essos with Viserys and Daenerys and whatever network of loyalists Varys was maintaining. The Wall was the correct solution. Stannis reached this conclusion within minutes of reading Varys's letter, because the conclusion was obvious to anyone who evaluated the situation through law rather than emotion. The Night's Watch was a legal mechanism, ancient, respected, functionally irreversible. A man who took the black ceased to exist as a political entity. His claims died. His bloodline terminated. His name became irrelevant. Jon Snow at the Wall was the same as Jon Snow dead, from a dynastic perspective, without the political cost of murder. Stannis summoned Davos. "You will go to King's Landing," Stannis said. "You will speak to Robert. You will present the legal analysis and recommend the Wall." Davos looked at his lord with the expression of a man who had been asked to perform this kind of service many times, and who never grew accustomed to the experience. "Your Grace, Robert will listen to me because he respects me. He will not listen to me because I am persuasive. I am the least persuasive man in your household. You are the most honest. Robert has spent 3 weeks surrounded by Cersei's manipulation, Varys' scheming, and Littlefinger's calculations. He needs someone who will tell him the truth without an agenda. You are that person. And if I fail, then my brother will make a mistake that damages the realm, and I will be required to consider my own response. I would prefer not to reach that point. Davos noted the word response, not opposition, not rebellion. Response. Stannis chose words the way he chose strategies, with precision, with intent, and with the understanding that words, once spoken, constituted commitments that could not be retracted without cost. I'll leave at dawn, Davos said. Leave tonight. Time is not a resource we have in surplus. Davos departed Dragonstone on a fast ship, cutting across the black water toward King's Landing with the efficiency of a man who had spent his life navigating these waters and who could find the harbor in darkness if necessary. Behind him, Stannis sat at the painted table and looked at the north, the carved representation of a territory that contained a boy whose blood could, if mismanaged, produce exactly the kind of succession crisis that Stannis had spent his life preparing to prevent. The law was clear. The solution was clear. The question was whether Robert Baratheon, a man who had built his life on emotion rather than law, could be brought to see clarity through the fog of grief and rage that 14 years of a comfortable lie had finally generated. The Onion Knight Davos Seaworth was not a man who sought audiences with kings. He was a smuggler, knighted for bringing onions to a starving castle, elevated from the docks of Fleabottom to the court of Dragonstone through a combination of competence, loyalty, and the counterintuitive judgment of a lord who rewarded service and punished the crime that enabled it in the same gesture. Davos had lost the tips of 4 fingers to Stannis' sense of justice, and had gained a knighthood from Stannis' sense of honor, and the duality had taught him more about power than any lord's education could provide. He found Robert in the Royal Solar 3 days after the Raven from Winterfell. The king was not drunk, a rarity that made the situation more alarming rather than less, because a sober Robert was a Robert who was preparing to act, and Robert's actions tended toward the irreversible. Seaworth, Robert looked up from Ned's letter, which lay on the desk with the worn creases of a document that had been folded and unfolded many times. You're Stannis' man. What are you doing in my solar? Lord Stannis sent me. He learnt of the situation through channels I would rather not describe, and he asked me to speak with you. Stannis has opinions. Lord Stannis always has opinions, Your Grace. In this case, his opinion is that the law supports your position. A Targaryen heir is a legal threat to the succession, and that the law also permits the resolution Lord Stark has proposed. The Night's Watch is a legal death. A man who takes the black ceases to exist in the eyes of the crown. Stannis would know about legal deaths. He's been legally dead to this court since I put him on Dragonstone. Davos let the bitterness pass without comment. Your Grace, may I speak freely? Everyone in this castle speaks freely except when I want them to. Go ahead. I grew up in Fleabottom. My father was a crabber. I have no education, no ancestry, no claim to wisdom beyond what experience has beaten into me. But I raised 7 sons before I became a knight, and I can tell you something about boys. I have 3 sons. You have 3 children who live in a castle and eat from golden plates and will never face a threat that their name and their guards cannot address. Lord Stark's boy, Lord Stark's nephew, is a 14-year-old who has just learned that his entire life was a lie, that his real father was the most hated man in the kingdom, and that the king wants him dead for the crime of being born. He did not choose his blood, Your Grace. He did not choose his parents. He did not choose the war that produced him. He is a boy whose mother died giving birth to him, and whose father died at the Trident, and he has done nothing, except grow up in a castle where the woman of the house treated him with contempt because she believed a lie that his uncle told to keep him alive. Robert's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. I am not asking for mercy, Your Grace. I am asking for proportion. The wall removes the threat. The wall removes the claim. The wall gives you what you want. A world without a Targaryen heir, without requiring you to become the man who murdered a child. You have spent 14 years living with the knowledge that Tywin Lannister murdered Rhaegar's other children. You accepted it. You benefited from it, and the acceptance has weighed on you, whether you admit the weight or not. I have seen it in the way you drink. I have seen it in the way you avoid speaking about the sack. Do not add to that weight, Your Grace. Let the boy take the black. Let the Night's Watch solve the problem that your anger cannot. The Solar was quiet. Outside, the Red Keep hummed with the ordinary business of governance, footsteps, distant voices, the sound of a castle that operated regardless of its king's emotional state. Robert sat in the silence and looked at Ned's letter, and looked at the smuggler knight who had said more honest words in 2 minutes than the entire small council had managed in 3 weeks. Stannis sent you to say this? Lord Stannis sent me to present the legal analysis. The rest was mine. You've got nerves, Seaworth. I've got fingers missing because I fed Lord Stannis's garrison during the siege. The nerve came with the stumps. Robert almost smiled. The expression was brief, a reflex that the surrounding grief could not fully suppress. He picked up Ned's letter, read it once more, and set it down. "Get out," he said. But the dismissal lacked force. It was the voice of a man sending away a messenger whose message he intended to accept, delivered with the bluntness that Robert used to disguise the moments when someone else's counsel had changed his mind. Davos bowed and left. The solar door closed behind him, and Robert Baratheon sat alone with a letter from his oldest friend, and a choice that would define whether friendship or rage was the stronger foundation. The White Wolf Jon went to the crypts alone. He had been in the crypts many times. Every Stark child explored them, dared each other to walk deeper, told stories about the kings of winter watching from their granite thrones. But Jon had always gone as a visitor, a bastard in the family tombs, walking among ancestors who were not his, paying respects at graves that did not belong to his bloodline. Now, one of them did. Lyanna's statue stood in the torchlight. Jon held the torch high and looked at the stone face of the woman who had given birth to him and died in the act. And the face looked back with the blind patience of carved granite, his mother's features rendered in a medium that preserved the shape and lost the life. She had been beautiful. Everyone said so. Robert said so. The stories said so. The songs that had been written about the tournament at Harrenhal said so. She had been beautiful and fierce and wild, and she had ridden like a northerner and fought like a man in a land where women were not supposed to fight. And she had fallen in love with the wrong prince, and the falling had started a war. Jon set the torch in a bracket and sat on the cold stone floor before his mother's statue. Ghost sat beside him, the white direwolf pressed against his leg, warm and solid and present in the way that Ghost was always present, without demand, without judgment. A companion whose loyalty was unconditional because the wolf did not deal in conditions. "I don't know what to call you," Jon said to the statue. "Mother feels wrong. I've never said it to anyone. Lady Stark was never. She was never that. And you were dead before I could speak." The stone said nothing. Stone never did. "They say my father kidnapped you. The whole realm believes it, that Rhaegar took you against your will, that the war was fought to rescue you, that Robert killed him out of love and justice. But that's not true, is it? You went with him. You chose him. You loved him." The torch flickered. Shadows moved across Lyanna's face, and for an instant the stone features shifted, not truly moving, but the light producing the impression of expression, and the expression looked like sorrow. "Lord Stark, Uncle Ned, says you made him promise. You put me in his arms, and you made him swear to protect me. And he did. He let everyone believe he had broken his vows. He let his wife hate me. He let the whole North think he was capable of dishonor. For me." Jon's hand found Ghost's fur. The wolf's warmth was the only warmth in the crypt. "I'm going to the wall. I was going anyway. I wanted to join the watch, be like Uncle Benjen, find something I could belong to that didn't care whether I was a bastard or a lord or a prince. I'm still going. But it means something different now. Before, it was a choice. Now, it's a sentence. The king wants me dead, and the wall is the only place he can't reach me without starting a war. He stood. The standing was deliberate, a boy rising in front of his mother's tomb with the weight of a name he had just received, and a future that had been stripped of every possibility except one. "I won't let your promise mean nothing," Jon told the statue. "Uncle Ned kept me alive for 14 years. I will not waste the life he gave me." He took the torch and walked back toward the entrance. Behind him, the crypts settled into darkness, the dead returning to their silence, and Lyanna's stone face resuming the expression it had worn for 14 years. Not grief, not joy, but the permanent composure of a woman whose story had been told by everyone except herself. The knife in the dark, the man arrived at Winterfell on a trade wagon from White Harbor, carrying saltfish and iron nails and the documentation of a legitimate merchant making a routine delivery to the North's most prominent castle. His name, per his papers, was Harren. His accent was Riverlands. His build was lean and functional. Not a soldier's build, but a craftsman's. Or what a craftsman's build would look like if the craft in question was killing people. Catelyn's warning, the 4-word message routed through White Harbor, origin unknown, had arrived 2 days before the merchant. She had not told Ned its source. She had told him its content. The boy is hunted. Ned had doubled the guard. Jory Castle posted men at Jon's chamber, at the exits, at the gates. Ghost, the white direwolf whose instincts exceeded any guards, slept at the foot of Jon's bed, and slept lightly, if direwolves could be said to sleep at all. The merchant delivered his goods. He ate in the servants' hall. He asked ordinary questions about the household, which rooms were occupied, which corridors led where, what time the young lords trained. The questions were invisible in their normality. Servants answered them the way servants answer any guest's casual curiosity, because curiosity was ordinary, and the man appeared to be ordinary. And the line between information gathering and conversation was too thin for untrained observers to detect. On his second night in Winterfell, Harren moved through the corridors of the guest wing toward the first keep. He carried no weapon that was visible. The blade was strapped to the inside of his forearm, held by a leather sheath that released with a practiced twist of the wrist. He walked without sound. He navigated without light. He was competent at his profession, which was the profession that Tywin Lannister employed when the target was small enough to be handled without an army. He did not reach Jon's door. Ghost heard him, or smelled him, or sensed him through whatever faculty direwolves possessed that human language could not name. The wolf's attack came from the shadows of the corridor, 5 feet of white fur and muscle and predatory violence, hitting the assassin at chest height with enough force to drive him into the stone wall. The blade came free, instinct overriding surprise, but the blade found fur, not flesh, and the wolf's jaws closed on the man's forearm with a pressure that turned bone to gravel. The scream brought the guards. Jory Castle reached the corridor with 3 men and found Ghost standing over a figure whose right arm was destroyed and whose professional composure had been replaced by the animal terror of a man who had just been defeated by a wolf in a dark hallway, and who was, by the growing pool of blood on the stones, unlikely to survive the defeat. "Who sent you?" Jory asked. The man did not answer. He died within the hour, blood loss and shock in combination, the body failing faster than any maester could intervene. But the blade told its own story. The weapon was expensive, castle-forged steel, not a common knife. The leather sheath was Westerland's work, identifiable by the tanning method. And the man's purse contained 20 gold dragons of recent Casterly Rock mintage. Ned stood over the body and did not need to be told where the order had originated. Tywin Lannister had reached for Jon across the length of the 7 kingdoms, and the reach had failed because a direwolf had been sleeping between the boy and the blade. The same direwolves that Catelyn had wanted left in the snow. The same wolves that had appeared on the King's Road as if the old gods had placed them there, which, if one believed in such things, was precisely what had happened. He sent 2 ravens. One to Robert, describing the attempt. One to Howland Reed at Greywater Watch, asking for the Crannogman's assistance in watching the neck for further agents. Then he went to Jon's chamber and found the boy awake, Ghost's bloodied muzzle resting on his knee, and told him that the departure for the Wall could not wait. The King's Wrath Robert received Ned's raven about the assassination attempt on the same day he had written, but not yet sent, his acceptance of Ned's terms. The acceptance letter sat on his desk, sealed with the Baratheon stag, ready for the rookery. It was not a warm letter. It was not a generous letter. It was a document that conveyed, in language stripped of affection, that the king would permit the boy to take the black and would consider the matter closed upon receipt of confirmation that the vows had been sworn. It was the minimum possible concession delivered in the minimum possible words. The second raven changed everything. An assassin. In Winterfell. Westerlands steel. Casterly Rock gold. The signature was Tywin Lannister's, not literal, but operational. Someone had decided that Robert's deliberation was taking too long, and had sent a man with a knife to resolve the question, while the king was still thinking about it. Robert's rage reformed. The direction changed, no longer aimed at Ned or the boy, but at the person who had presumed to act in Robert's name without Robert's authority. The person who had decided that the king's judgment was too slow, and that a Lannister's judgment should substitute. The person who treated the crown as a subsidiary of Casterly Rock, with the king as a figurehead whose decisions could be preempted when they did not arrive on the Lannister schedule. He summoned Cersei. The summoning was not a request. 2 Kingsguard collected the queen from her chambers and escorted her to the king's solar with the courtesy wrapped around compulsion that characterized royal communications between spouses who despised each other. "Your father," Robert said. Cersei did not pretend ignorance. The pretense would have been futile. The raven's contents were already being discussed by the council. And the council included Varys, whose information reached every ear in the Red Keep faster than any official channel. "I wrote to my father because the Targaryen threat required decisive action. You were taking too long. Decisive action. You had a man sent to murder a 14-year-old in his bed. I had a threat neutralized. The method was my father's choosing, not mine. The method was the murder of a boy, under the protection of the Warden of the North, the same warden who is my oldest friend, whose household your father has just violated, whose trust in the crown your father has just destroyed. Do you understand what you've done? I have done what you should have done in Winterfell, instead of spending 4 days sulking in the Godswood and then riding home without resolving anything." Robert stood. The standing was the full elevation of a man who had been sitting for days and who now brought his entire height and weight to bear on the woman across the desk. Not a physical threat, but a physical statement. The body expressing what the voice was about to deliver. "You do not act for the crown. You do not write to your father about matters of state. You do not dispatch agents into the north or anywhere else without my knowledge and my consent. You are the queen. You are not the hand. You are not the king. And if your father sends another man north, another knife, another assassin, another Lannister instrument of any kind, I will consider it an act of treason against the crown, and I will respond accordingly." Cersei's face did not change. The absence of reaction was itself a reaction, the controlled stillness of a woman who had learned, through 14 years of marriage to a man she could not respect, that showing emotion was a concession she would not make. "The boy is Rhaegar's heir," she said. "The boy is taking the black. He will be a brother of the Night's Watch within the month. His blood will mean nothing. His name will mean nothing. And your father's assassin, the one who failed, because a direwolf tore his arm off in a corridor in Winterfell, will be the last Lannister action taken in this matter. Am I understood? You are understood. Good. Get out." She left. The door closed. Robert sat heavily and looked at the 2 letters on his desk, his acceptance of Ned's terms and Ned's report of the assassination attempt, and the juxtaposition produced a clarity that neither letter alone could have generated. He had spent weeks consumed by rage at Ned for hiding a Targaryen. While he raged, the Lannisters had tried to murder the boy in his sleep. The Lannisters, the family whose approach to political problems was to kill children and call it pragmatism. The family Robert had married into. The family whose methods Robert claimed to despise while benefiting from their results. He picked up his acceptance letter broke the seal, and rewrote it. The new letter was different, not warm. Robert was not yet capable of warmth on this subject. But different. The new letter acknowledged the assassination attempt. It condemned it. It guaranteed that no further action would be taken against Jon by the Crown or its agents. And it ended with a line that had not appeared in the original version. "I am still angry, Ned. I may always be angry. But I will not be the man who kills children. Send the boy to the wall. Let this end." The Raven flew north that evening, carrying the only words of genuine reconciliation Robert Baratheon had managed in his adult life, and the words were sufficient. Not generous, not complete, but sufficient to preserve the remnant of a bond that had nearly been consumed by the fire of an old love and an older hate. The wall Jon Snow arrived at Castle Black on the 23rd day of the 11th month, riding a shaggy northern horse with Ghost loping beside him, and an escort of 20 Stark men who would return south once the boy had taken his oath. The wall rose above them, 700 feet of ice, the largest structure built by human hands in the known world, stretching from the gorge to the shivering sea in a band of frozen white that divided the realms of men from whatever waited in the dark beyond. Jon had imagined it many times. He had not imagined the scale. The wall was not a wall. It was a cliff made by men who feared something enough to stack ice until the stack reached the sky. Benjen Stark met him at the gate. The first ranger embraced his nephew now, the pretense abandoned between them, with the rough efficiency of a man who had been expecting this arrival and who had prepared for it by not preparing. "You know," Jon said, "I've always known. Ned told me before he left for King's Landing the first time. I've been keeping it since then. Everyone kept it. Everyone but me." Benjen released him. "You're here now. What you were before doesn't matter to the Watch. What you are when you take the Black, that's the only version that counts." The Lord Commander, Jor Mormont, the Old Bear, a northerner who had ruled Castle Black with the methodical competence of a man who treated every problem as a logistics exercise, greeted Jon in the common hall. "Lord Stark's letter preceded you. I know your situation. I don't care about your situation. At the wall, you're a recruit. Your blood, your family, your claim, none of it means anything here. You'll train with the others. You'll serve where I assign you. If you're as capable as your uncle claims, you'll rise. If you're not, you'll dig latrines. Any questions?" "No, my lord." "Good. Mormont men don't waste words. Neither should Stark men, or whatever you are." Jon was assigned a cell in the recruits' quarters, a stone room the size of a closet, with a straw mattress and a window slit that faced north toward the true darkness. Ghost circled the room once, sniffed the mattress, and settled on the floor with the resigned acceptance of a wolf who had slept in worse places, and who would sleep in worse places still. That evening, Jon was brought to see Maester Aemon. The old man occupied chambers near the top of the Maester's tower, rooms heated by a small fire that burned constantly, tended by a steward named Clydas. The warmth necessary, because Aemon Targaryen was 100 years old, and the cold that young men endured as discomfort was, at his age, genuinely lethal. Aemon sat in a chair by the fire. He was blind, his eyes milky, unfocused, directed toward the warmth by habit rather than sight. His face was ancient, the skin drawn tight across bones that seemed to exist primarily as an architecture for the intelligence that still operated behind the useless eyes. He was small, fragile, and entirely present. "They tell me Eddard Stark has sent his nephew to the wall," Aemon said. His voice was thin, but precise. A voice that had been delivering information for a century and that had not lost its clarity even as everything else had been surrendered to time. "They tell me the nephew carries a name I have not heard spoken at Castle Black since I arrived here 60 years ago." "Targaryen," Jon said. "Targaryen." Aemon repeated the name the way a man repeats the name of a country he has not visited in decades, with recognition, with distance, with the accumulated weight of everything the name had cost him, and everyone who had carried it. "I am Aemon Targaryen, son of Maekar, brother of Aegon the Unlikely. I was offered the crown, and refused it. I took the black because I still believe, that a maester's duty and a night's watchman's oath were worth more than a king's privilege. I have watched my family destroy itself from this distance for 60 years. The madness, the ambition, the fire. I have watched all of it. And I have stayed here, because here was the only place where my blood could not be used as a weapon. Jon stood before the old man and felt the weight of a connection he had not expected. The meeting of two Targaryens who had both arrived at the wall because the world south of it had no safe place for what they were. "You are Rhaegar's son," Aemon said. Not a question. Yes, Rhaegar. The name carried its own weather in Aemon's voice. Warmth and grief, and the memory of a letter that had arrived decades ago describing a boy who read books and played the harp and who had looked at the stars and decided that he was meant for something that the stars had not, in the event, delivered. He was the best of them. The best and the most doomed. He believed in prophecy the way your uncle believes in honor, with an absoluteness that made him noble and that killed him. I don't know what to believe about him. The realm says he was a kidnapper. My uncle says my mother loved him. Your mother loved him. Aemon's certainty was the certainty of a man who had lived long enough to see the same stories repeat across generations and who could read the pattern regardless of the details. The Starks and the Targaryens are old blood. When old blood meets, it produces either war or love, and sometimes both in the same act. Your parents' love produced a war. The war produced a kingdom. The kingdom produced your exile. And your exile has brought you here, to the last Targaryen in Westeros, who has been waiting, without knowing it, for the next one. Aemon extended his hand. The hand was skeletal, spotted, warm from the fire. Jon took it, and the contact was the first physical connection he had experienced with his father's bloodline. The handshake of an old man who had outlived every member of his family, and a young man who had just learned he belonged to that family. Meeting at the edge of the world, where names were supposed to be surrendered. "You will take the black," Aemon said. "Yes, and the name, the Targaryen name, you will set it aside. That's the agreement. It is a good agreement. The name has brought nothing but grief to those who carried it. Set it down, Jon Snow. Take your vows. Serve the watch. And when the long night comes, and it will come, be the man your uncle raised you to be, not the prince your blood says you should have been." The oath Jon Snow took the black on a morning so cold that the words frosted in the air as he spoke them. He knelt before the heart tree beyond the wall. The Night's Watch maintained a weirwood grove in the haunted forest for recruits who followed the old gods. And Jon followed the old gods, because Ned Stark followed the old gods, and every true thing Jon had learned about himself had come from the man who had raised him under a name that was not his own. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. The words were ancient. They had been spoken by thousands of men across 8,000 years. Men who gave up their names, their claims, their families, their futures. The oath was a death, the legal annihilation of everything a man had been, replaced by the identity of a brother of the Watch. Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, nephew of Eddard Stark, son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, heir to a dynasty that had ruled for 300 years. All of it dissolved in the speaking. The words were acid. They consumed everything. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father no children. Ghost sat beside him, red eyes fixed on the weirwood's face. The white direwolf in the white snow before the white tree, 3 shades of the same color, belonging to the same landscape. I shall wear no crowns and win no glory. He was 15 now. His name day had passed on the road north, unmarked and uncelebrated, the transition from 14 to 15 occurring somewhere in the empty miles between Winterfell and the Wall. 15 years old. The age at which his father had won the tournament at Harrenhal had crowned Lyanna Stark the Queen of Love and Beauty. Had set in motion the chain of events that produced a war, a rebellion, a dynasty's fall, and a baby born in a blood-soaked tower in the Red Mountains of Dawn. I shall live and die at my post. Benjen watched from the edge of the grove. His face held the composed grief of a man witnessing his nephew make a sacrifice that should not have been necessary, and that was, given the alternatives. the only possible choice. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the fire that burns against the cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers, the shield that guards the realms of men. The words emptied him. Jon felt them leave, felt the identity he had carried for 15 years detach and fall away, replaced by the oath's cold architecture. He was no longer Jon Snow. He was no longer a Targaryen. He was a brother of the Night's Watch, and the Night's Watch did not concern itself with the politics of kings, or the blood of princes, or the grief of men who had lost women they loved to men they hated. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch, for this night and all the nights to come. He rose. The grove was silent. The weirwood's red eyes watched with the same expression they had watched everything for 8,000 years. The expression of gods who witnessed but did not intervene, who remembered but did not judge, who observed the full scope of human choice and allowed every choice to stand. Benjen clasped Jon's shoulder. Brother, brother. The word was new. It meant something different here. Not the false brotherhood of a bastard pretending to belong in a true-born family, not the political brotherhood of houses bound by alliance. The Watch's brotherhood was literal. Men who shared a wall and a duty, and the understanding that the duty would outlast every individual who performed it. Jon walked back toward Castle Black, with Ghost at his side, and the oath settling into his bones. Behind him, the weirwood grove disappeared into the forest. Ahead, the wall rose, 700 feet of ice, the boundary between the known world and everything that waited beyond it. His world, now, the only world the oath permitted. In the Maester's Tower, Aemon Targaryen sat by his fire and listened to Clydas describe the ceremony. The old man's face carried an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been sorrow. The two emotions so intertwined in a man who had survived a century that distinguishing between them would have required a sensitivity that no observer possessed. He spoke the words, Clydas reported. Good, Aemon said. The words are a cage and a shelter. He will learn, in time, that the cage is the shelter, that the oath which takes everything also provides the one thing his blood could never give him. What is that? Peace. Ooh, 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 ooh. The promise the letter arrived at Winterfell on a morning in late autumn, carried by a raven that had crossed the length of the north from Castle Black. Catelyn brought it to Ned in the Godswood, the same Godswood where Robert had learned the truth, where the weirwood's face still watched with its ancient, unblinking patience. Ned opened the letter and read Jon's handwriting, which was neat and careful, and carried the penmanship of a boy who had been taught by Maester Luwin and who had retained the lessons. Uncle, the oath is sworn. I am a brother of the Night's Watch. I have met Maester Aemon. He is old and blind, and he is the wisest man I have spoken to since leaving Winterfell. He told me that the oath is a cage and a shelter, and I think he is right, though I do not yet know which I need more. Ghost is with me. The wall is larger than anyone described. The cold is deeper than anything Winterfell prepared me for, and I trained in Winterfell, so that is saying something. I do not blame you for the lie. I understand why you told it, and I understand what it cost you, your honor, your wife's trust, 14 years of carrying a weight that no man should carry alone. You kept your promise to my mother. I will keep my oath to the Watch. The promises we make to the dead are the ones we cannot break, because the dead trusted us with them, and the dead cannot release us from them. I am well. I am alive. Both of those things are because of you. Jon, Ned read the letter twice. He folded it and placed it inside his doublet, against his chest, where the paper's warmth mixed with his own. Catelyn stood beside him. She had read the letter over his shoulder. The intimacy of a wife who had earned the right to read her husband's correspondence through 14 years of marriage, and the recent, wrenching addition of truth to that marriage's foundation. He's safe, Catelyn said. He's at the wall. Safe is a generous word for it. He's alive. He's free from Robert's rage. He's under Benjen's watch and Aemon's guidance. And the oath protects him from every claim, every ambition, every man who would use his blood as a weapon. The oath protects him from men who respect oaths. Not every man does. Enough do. Enough to make the oath matter. They stood in the godswood, husband and wife, in the place where their household had fractured and was now, with the slow and painful labor of two people rebuilding trust across a chasm of 14 years' deception, beginning to repair. The repair would not be fast. The repair might never be complete. But the work had started, and the work was honest, and honest work was the only foundation that Ned Stark had ever trusted. A second raven arrived that afternoon, from King's Landing, in Robert's hand. "Ned, I received confirmation from Castle Black. The boy has taken his vows. The matter is closed. I do not forgive you. I may not ever forgive you. But I will not make war on you, and I will not send men north, and I will not, as your wife's anonymous correspondent apparently feared, send Lannister knives into your household. The boy is a brother of the Night's Watch. Let that be the end of it. There is a hole where our friendship was. I do not know if anything fills it, but I am not the man who murders children. You made sure of that, even when I wanted to be." Robert, in his own hand, below the royal seal. Ned read the letter. He did not smile. The letter did not invite smiles. It was the minimum possible acknowledgement that a friendship had survived, delivered by a man whose pride would not permit warmth and whose decency would not permit silence. The friendship was not restored. It was preserved, the way a structure is preserved after a fire, damaged and diminished, but still standing, still recognizable as the thing it had been before the flames. He placed Robert's letter beside Jon's, inside his doublet, against his chest. 2 letters. 2 promises kept. The promise to Lyanna, "Protect my son," and the unspoken promise to Robert, "I will not let you become the worst version of yourself." Both honored. Both at enormous cost. Both carrying consequences that would extend beyond the lifetimes of the men who had made them. Ned sat beneath the heart tree. The godswood was still. The weirwood's face wept its red sap. Ghost's absence was palpable. The first time in years that the white direwolf was not somewhere in Winterfell, padding through corridors, sitting at Jon's feet. The wolf was at the wall now, with the boy, the young man, who had given up every claim to be what he was born to be in exchange for the only safety the world could offer him. Above Winterfell, the sky was the deep northern grey that preceded winter, not clouds, but the sky itself changing, the atmosphere thickening, the world announcing that the season of warmth was ending, and the season of cold was arriving with the patience and certainty that characterized everything the North produced. Winter was coming. It always was, and at the wall, a boy with the blood of dragons and wolves stood his post and watched the darkness beyond the ice, and began the long work of becoming the man he had chosen to be, rather than the man his blood said he should have been. A candle burned in the maester's tower at Castle Black. An old man sat beside it, listening to the wind, remembering a family that had destroyed itself across a century of fire and ambition and prophecy. The last of them, the very last, was on the wall now. Not a king, not a prince. A brother of the Night's Watch, carrying a white wolf and a northern name and the blood of the dragon, standing between the world and whatever waited in the dark. The candle flickered. The wind blew, and Aemon Targaryen, 100 years old, blind, ancient, the sole surviving witness to 6 decades of Targaryen history, smiled. The boy would be all right.